I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought a cheap motel could be the setting for the most terrifying night of my life. But as I lay here in the dark, listening to the footsteps outside my door, I realize how wrong I was. It all started when my car broke down on the outskirts of a small town I'd never heard of. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a place to stay for the night. That's when I saw the flickering neon sign of the Pinewood Motel, its vacancy light a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. As I pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place looked run down, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds pushing through cracks in the asphalt. But beggars can't be choosers, and I was desperate for a bed and a hot shower. The bell above the office door jangled as I stepped inside. The smell of stale cigarettes and musty carpets hit me like a wave. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he'd seen better days. His greasy hair hung in limp strands around a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. "Need a room?" I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man's eyes roamed over me, lingering a bit too long for comfort. "Just you?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. I nodded, suddenly wishing I wasn't alone. He handed me a key attached to a faded plastic tag. "Room 13, he said, the ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "Lucky you." As I walked to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of curtains quickly closing in one of the other rooms. My skin prickled with unease. The room was about what I expected, small, musty, with furniture that had seen better decades. But it was a place to sleep, and that's all I needed. I dropped my bag on the bed and headed for the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the tension knotting my shoulders. The pipes groaned and sputtered before finally producing a weak stream of lukewarm water. As I was rinsing my hair, I could have sworn I heard the door to my room open and close. My heart leapt into my throat. I shut off the water and listened, hardly daring to breathe. Silence. Cautiously, I peeked out of the bathroom. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. I must have imagined it, I told myself, but I couldn't quite believe it. I quickly dried off and got dressed, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night fell, the motel came alive with strange sounds. Footsteps paced back and forth in the room above me. Voices murmured in the parking lot, too low to make out words but charged with an intensity that made me uneasy. Occasionally, I'd hear a thump or a muffled cry from somewhere nearby, setting my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the ancient set only picked up 2 channels, both filled with static. I flipped through a dog-eared magazine left in the nightstand drawer, but the articles were outdated and uninteresting. Sleep seemed impossible, but I knew I needed to rest if I was going to deal with my car in the morning. Just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard a knock at my door. I froze, my hand halfway to the lamp switch. Who could it be at this hour? The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the quiet room. No answer, just another knock. Heart pounding. I approached the door. Through the peephole, I could see a woman standing outside. She looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a messy bun. But there was something in her eyes, a wild, desperate look that made me hesitate. "Please," she said, her voice muffled through the door. "I need help. Let me in." Every instinct screamed at me to keep the door closed. But what if she really was in trouble? I undid the chain and opened the door a crack. "What's wrong?" I asked, ready to slam it shut at the first sign of danger. The woman's eyes darted around nervously. "They're coming," she whispered. "We have to get out of here, now." Before I could respond, she pushed past me into the room. I stumbled back, shocked by her sudden movement. She immediately went to the window, peeking out through the curtains. "Who's coming?" I demanded, fear and confusion battling for dominance in my mind. "What's going on?" She turned to me, her face pale in the dim light. "You don't know?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. "How long have you been here?" "I just checked in this evening," I said, growing more uneasy by the second. "My car broke down." The woman laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "That's how they get you. Your car didn't break down by accident." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She opened her mouth to answer, but froze as the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped right in front of my door. "They're here," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The doorknob began to turn slowly. I realized with horror that in my confusion, I hadn't relocked the door after letting the woman in. She grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the bathroom. "Quick," she hissed. "We have to hide." We crammed ourselves into the tiny bathroom, barely daring to breathe as we heard the room door open. Heavy footsteps entered the room, accompanied by the sound of drawers being opened and furniture being moved. "Where are they?" a gruff voice demanded. "Not here," another voice answered. "Check the next room." The footsteps retreated, and the door closed. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered to the woman. She put a finger to her lips, shaking her head. After a few moments of tense silence, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "This isn't just a motel," she said. "It's a trap. They lure in travelers, people who won't be missed, and then..." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "And then what?" I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "They take them," she said simply. "Sell them, kill them for sport, use them for God knows what. I've been trying to escape for weeks." My mind reeled, struggling to process what she was saying. It sounded insane, like something out of a horror movie. But the fear in her eyes, the sounds I'd heard, the strange behavior of the staff, it all started to fit together in a terrifying picture. "We have to get out of here," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. She nodded. "There's a window in the back, behind the dumpsters. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." Slowly, cautiously, we emerged from the bathroom. The room was a mess, drawers pulled out and mattress overturned. They had searched thoroughly, but thankfully hadn't thought to check the bathroom. We crept to the door, listening intently for any sound of movement outside. Hearing nothing, we slipped out into the night. The parking lot was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of the neon sign. We stuck to the shadows, making our way around the edge of the building towards the back. Just as the dumpsters came into view, a shout rang out behind us. "There they are!" We ran, no longer caring about stealth. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after us, gaining ground quickly. The woman reached the window first, struggling to push it open. I turned to look behind us and saw 3 men running towards us, their faces twisted with rage. With a final heave, the window creaked open. The woman scrambled through, then turned to help me. I was halfway through when I felt a hand grasp my ankle. I kicked wildly, connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, and I tumbled through the window onto the ground outside. We ran into the woods behind the motel, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. I could hear our pursuers crashing through the trees behind us, but their voices grew fainter as we put distance between us. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped, gasping for breath. In the faint pre-dawn light, I could see a road ahead. We had made it. As we walked towards the road, hoping to flag down a passing car, the woman turned to me. "I'm Sarah," she said, offering a tired smile. "Alice," I replied, still trying to process everything that had happened. "Thank you, Alice," Sarah said softly. "I couldn't have made it out alone." I nodded, words failing me. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, I realized how close I had come to never seeing another dawn. The Pinewood Motel faded into the distance behind us, but I knew its horrors would haunt my dreams for years to come. The neon sign of Joe's Pizza flickered in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, the aroma of pepperoni and cheese filling my car. Little did I know that this routine delivery would lead me into a nightmare I never could have imagined. Sometimes, the most terrifying journeys begin with the most innocent of destinations. It was a slow Tuesday night, and I was grateful for the ping of the delivery app. Any extra cash was welcome, especially with rent coming due. The address was unfamiliar, somewhere on the outskirts of town where the streetlights grew sparse and the houses were few and far between. I hummed along to the radio, my headlights cutting through the darkness as I navigated the winding country roads. The GPS directed me to turn onto a narrow gravel driveway, barely visible among the overgrown bushes. As I drove deeper into the property, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Finally, I spotted a house, if you could call it that. It was more like a dilapidated shack, its windows dark and its paint peeling. A single bulb flickered weakly above the front door, casting eerie shadows across the porch. I grabbed the pizza box and approached the house, gravel crunching under my feet. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, and knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was no response. I was about to knock again when I heard movement inside. Slow, shuffling footsteps approached the door. It creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a horror movie. He was tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. His eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Pizza delivery," I stammered, holding out the box. The man's face split into a grin, revealing yellow, crooked teeth. Yes, he said, his voice raspy. Come in, I'll get your money." Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but I reminded myself that I was just being paranoid. It was just an odd old man in a creepy house, nothing to be afraid of. I stepped inside and immediately regretted it. The smell hit me first, a musty, sour odor that made my nose wrinkle. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered, with stacks of newspapers and old furniture creating a maze-like path through the room. "Just wait here," the man said, disappearing into another room. I stood awkwardly in the entryway, shifting my weight from foot to foot. My eyes darted around, taking in the strange decor. Faded photographs covered one wall, their subjects and eyes seeming to follow me, too. On a nearby table, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A collection of newspaper clippings, all about missing persons in the area. The man returned, but instead of money, he held a gun. My heart leapt into my throat as he pointed it at me, that unsettling grin still plastered on his face. "Now," he said, his tone casual as if he were discussing the weather, "you're going to do exactly as I say." I raised my hand slowly, the pizza box falling to the floor with a dull thud. "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. Just take my wallet and let me go." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I don't want your money, boy. You're going to help me with something far more important." He gestured with the gun, directing me further into the house. I had no choice but to comply, my mind racing with possible escape routes. We passed through a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, pots and pans piled high in the sink, before entering what appeared to be a study. The room was dominated by a large desk covered in papers and strange-looking devices. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with old volumes and jars containing things I didn't want to examine too closely. "Sit," the man commanded, pointing to a chair in the corner. I sat, my legs feeling like jelly. "What do you want from me?" I asked, hating how my voice quavered. The man's eyes gleamed with a manic light. "You, my young friend, are going to help me get my revenge. You see, the owner of that pizza place you work for, Joe, he ruined my life. He launched into a long, rambling story about how Joe had supposedly cheated him out of his life savings, driven him to bankruptcy, and destroyed his family. With each word, his agitation grew, spittle flying from his lips as he gesticulated wildly with the gun. I listened in horror, realizing I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was the lair of a madman with a grudge. So you see, he concluded, leaning in close enough that I could smell his rancid breath. Joe needs to pay, and you're going to help me make that happen. How? I asked, my mouth dry with fear. He grinned again, that terrible yellow grin. You're going to call him. Tell him you've had car trouble and need him to come out here. And when he arrives, he made a slashing motion across his throat. I felt sick. This lunatic wanted me to lure my boss to his death. I can't do that, I stammered. Please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone about this, I swear. The man's face darkened. You don't have a choice, boy. You'll do as I say, or you'll never leave this house alive. He shoved a phone into my hands. With trembling fingers, I dialed Joe's number, praying he wouldn't answer. But after 3 rings, I heard his familiar voice. Hello? I swallowed hard, the man's gun pressed against my temple. Hey, Joe, it's Mike. I've had some car trouble out on Old Mill Road. Could you come give me a hand? There was a pause, and for a moment I thought Joe might refuse. But then he sighed. All right, Mike, I'll be there in about 20 minutes. Sit tight. The call ended, and the man snatched the phone away, cackling with glee. Excellent, excellent, he crowed. Now, we wait. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The man paced back and forth, muttering to himself and occasionally stopping to peer out the window. I sat frozen in the chair, my mind racing. I knew I had to do something, but with the gun trained on me, any move seemed impossible. As the sound of an approaching car reached us, the man's excitement grew palpable. It's time, he hissed, grabbing my arm and yanking me to my feet. Remember, one wrong move and you're dead. He dragged me to the front door, positioning me so that I was visible but keeping himself hidden behind it. I heard car doors slam, then footsteps on the gravel. Mike, Joe's voice called out. You out here, kid? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The man jabbed the gun into my ribs, and I managed to croak, Over here, Joe. As Joe approached, I could see the confusion on his face. He was a good man, always fair to his employees. Whatever grudge this madman held against him, I knew it couldn't be justified. Just as Joe reached the porch, I made my decision. I couldn't let this happen. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I shoved backwards, catching my captor off guard. We tumbled to the floor in a tangle of limbs, the gun skittering across the wooden planks. Run, Joe! I yelled, struggling to keep the man pinned down. Call the police! Joe, to his credit, reacted quickly. He scooped up the gun and trained it on the man, his hand steady despite the shock evident on his face. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. The man beneath me had gone still, all the fight seeming to drain out of him now that he was disarmed. He began to sob, great heaving cries that shook his entire body. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by Joe's call. As they led the man away in handcuffs, I sat on the porch steps, my legs too shaky to stand. Joe sat beside me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. You okay, kid? He asked, concern etching his features. I nodded, though I knew it would be a long time before I was truly okay. Yeah, I said. I don't think I'll be making any more deliveries for a while. Joe chuckled, a welcome sound after the night's horrors. I think you've earned a nice, long vacation and a raise. As we watched the police cars drive away, their red and blue lights fading into the distance, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The night's events had shown me how quickly an ordinary situation could turn into a nightmare. but it had also shown me my own strength, a resilience I didn't know I possessed. I knew the memory of this night would stay with me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. But as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I also felt a glimmer of hope. I had faced my worst fear and survived. Whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. The pizza, forgotten on the floor of that horrible house, had long since gone cold. But as Joe and I drove back to town, I found I had never been more grateful for a ruined delivery in my life. The snap of a twig under my boot echoed through the forest like a gunshot. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw them, shadowy figures moving between the trees, and I knew in that instant my leisurely hike had just become a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I'd been feeling stressed at work, and my therapist suggested I try spending some time in nature. Reconnect with the earth, she'd said, her voice soothing and reassuring. It'll do wonders for your anxiety. So here I was, 3 hours into a hike in the Cascade Mountains, my backpack full of trail mix and bottled water, and not another soul in sight. Or so I thought. The day had started beautifully. The sun filtered through the canopy of evergreens, dappling the forest floor with warm light. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt my worries melting away with each step, the rhythm of my boots on the trail becoming a meditation of sorts. I'd veered off the main path about an hour ago, drawn by the sound of rushing water. I found a pristine stream, its clear water bubbling over smooth rocks. I stopped to refill my water bottle, marveling at how clean and fresh it tasted compared to the tap water back home. That's when I heard it, voices carried on the wind, too faint to make out words, but clearly human. I felt a twinge of disappointment. I'd been enjoying the solitude, but I reminded myself that other hikers had just as much right to be here as I did. I shouldered my pack and started walking again, figuring I'd either catch up to the group ahead or they'd move on and I'd have the trail to myself again. But as I rounded a bend, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. In a small clearing just off the trail, I saw a group of men. They weren't hikers. They wore dark clothes, and even from this distance, I could see they were armed. Surrounding them were crates, dozens of them. One was open, and I could see packages wrapped in brown paper inside. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. This deep in the woods, this far from any road, it had to be something illegal. Drugs, maybe, or weapons. My pulse quickened as I realized I was witnessing something I definitely wasn't supposed to see. I took a step backward, intending to quietly retrace my steps and get as far away from here as possible. That's when I stepped on the twig, the crack seeming to echo through the entire forest. The men's heads snapped in my direction. For a moment, we all froze, locked in a tableau of mutual surprise. Then, one of them shouted, and they started moving towards me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between me and those men. I could hear them behind me, their shouts growing fainter as I ran but never disappearing entirely. My lungs burned, and branches whipped at my face, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green blur of the forest. Finally, when my legs felt like they were about to give out, I spotted a dense thicket of bushes. Without thinking, I dove in, ignoring the thorns that scraped my arms and face. I lay there, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. For a long while, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, distantly, I heard voices again. "He couldn't have gotten far," one said, his voice gruff and angry. "Spread out," another responded. "He's got to be around here somewhere." I pressed myself closer to the ground, hardly daring to breathe. They were looking for me. And based on what I'd seen, I had a sickening feeling about what would happen if they found me. The voices grew closer, and I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. I closed my eyes, as if not seeing them could somehow prevent them from seeing me. "Check those bushes," a voice said, alarmingly close. I tensed, ready to bolt, though I knew it was hopeless. I was trapped. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, a loud, electronic beeping. One of the men swore. "It's the perimeter alarm," he said. "Someone else is in the area." "Shit," another voice responded. "We need to get back and secure the product. This guy will have to wait." I heard their footsteps retreating, moving quickly away from my hiding spot. Even after I could no longer hear them, I remained frozen in place, afraid to move a muscle. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the woods, being hunted by dangerous men, with no idea which direction would lead me to safety. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear and indecision. The light began to fade, the forest growing darker around me. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of terror through me. Finally, as true darkness began to fall, I forced myself to move. My muscles protested as I crawled out of the thicket, thorns catching on my clothes and skin. I stood on shaky legs, trying to orient myself. The forest looked different in the twilight, shadows turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. I picked a direction that I hoped would lead me away from the clearing and started walking, moving as quietly as I could. Every sound made me jump. An owl's hoot nearly sent me into a panic, convinced for a moment that it was a human call. The crack of a branch in the distance had me diving for cover, only to realize it was probably just a deer or some other animal. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness growing more complete. I was afraid to use my flashlight, worried it might attract attention, so I stumbled along by the faint light of the moon filtering through the trees. Just when I was beginning to lose hope, convinced I was walking in circles, I saw something that made my heart leap. Lights in the distance. Not the harsh glare of flashlights, but the warm glow of windows, civilization. I quickened my pace, hope giving me a second wind. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of buildings, a small cluster of cabins, a campground or ranger station, perhaps. I burst out of the tree line, probably looking like a madman with my torn clothes and wild eyes. A couple sitting around a campfire looked up in alarm. "Please," I gasped, my voice hoarse. "I need help. There are men in the woods, dangerous men. We need to call the police." The next few hours passed in a blur. The couple, Tom and Sarah, were kind enough to let me use their phone to call 911. They gave me water and a blanket, and sat with me while we waited for the authorities to arrive. I told my story to the park rangers, and then again to the police when they arrived. They took my statement seriously, immediately organizing search parties to sweep the area I'd come from. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in brilliant pinks and oranges, a police officer approached me. "We found the clearing you described," he said. "There was evidence of recent activity, but whoever was there is long gone now. We'll keep investigating, but it looks like you stumbled onto a major drug operation." I nodded, too exhausted to feel much beyond a dull relief. The officer assured me they would need to ask more questions later, but for now, I was free to go. Tom and Sarah offered to drive me back to my car, an act of kindness I'll never forget. As we drove down the winding mountain road, I stared out the window at the peaceful forest. It looked so different in the morning light. Beautiful, serene, hiding no darker purpose. But I knew the truth now. I had seen the darkness that could lurk in even the most picturesque places. I knew it would be a long time before I could look at a forest the same way again. My therapist had suggested nature as a cure for my anxiety, but instead, it had given me a whole new set of fears. Yet as we drove further from the mountains, I felt a strange sense of strength growing within me. I had faced true danger and survived. Whatever challenges lay ahead in my normal life, I knew I could face them. The weekend getaway hadn't gone as planned, but as I finally reached my car and began the long drive home, I realized it had changed me in ways I never could have anticipated. The forest had shown me both the darkest and brightest aspects of human nature, the dangerous men who had hunted me, and the kind strangers who had taken me in. As the mountains receded in my rearview mirror, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let this experience break me. Instead, I would use it as a reminder of my own resilience. The woods may have held danger, but they had also shown me my own strength, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. The crackling of our campfire was suddenly drowned out by a sound that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. As I turned, I saw them emerge from the shadows, their eyes glinting with malice. In that moment, I realized our family camping trip had just become a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. My wife, Sarah, and I had been planning this trip for months. Our kids, Ethan and Lily, were finally old enough to appreciate the great outdoors, and we were excited to share our love of nature with them. We'd chosen a remote spot in the Adirondacks, far from the crowded campgrounds and tourist traps. "It'll be an adventure," I told the kids, not realizing how prophetic those words would become. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked through lush forests, marveled at crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings roasting marshmallows around the campfire. Ethan, at 12, was full of questions about the plants and animals we encountered. 9-year-old Lily delighted in collecting pretty rocks and leaves. Sarah and I exchanged contented smiles, feeling like we'd made the right choice in unplugging from the world for a while. On the third day, we decided to venture further into the wilderness. I'd spotted a beautiful valley on our map, about a day's hike from our campsite. We packed enough supplies for an overnight stay, planning to camp in the valley before heading back the next day. The hike was challenging but rewarding. The kids complained a bit about the distance, but their grumbles turned to exclamations of wonder when we reached our destination. The valley was a picturesque paradise, with a small lake surrounded by towering pines and rocky outcroppings. We set up camp near the lake, and I took Ethan fishing while Sarah and Lily looked for wildflowers. As the sun began to set, we gathered around our campfire, tired but happy. That's when everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong was a rustling in the bushes, too heavy to be a small animal. I saw Sarah tense up, her eyes scanning the tree line. Before I could say anything, they appeared. 3 men stepped into the firelight, and I felt my heart skip a beat. They weren't fellow hikers or park rangers. These men looked rough, with unkempt beards and tattered clothes. But it was their eyes that truly frightened me, cold and hard, filled with a hostility that made my skin crawl. Well, well," the tallest one drawled, his lips curling into a sneer. "Looks like we've got some city folk trespassing on our territory." I stood up slowly, trying to position myself between the men and my family. "We didn't realize this area was off limits," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the valley. "Oh, I don't think so. See, you've wandered into our neck of the woods, and we don't take kindly to outsiders." That's when I heard the click of the rifle and saw the glint of the barrel in the firelight. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. Sarah had pulled the kids close to her, her face pale with fear. "Look," I said, holding my hands up in a placating gesture. "We don't want any trouble. We have some money, camping gear. It's all yours. Just let us go." The man with the rifle stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "It ain't about the money," he growled. "This is our land, has been for generations, and we've got ways of dealing with trespassers." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I realized with growing horror that these men had no intention of letting us leave. They were toying with us, like cats playing with mice before the kill. In that moment, some primal instinct took over. Run! I shouted, grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a burning log from the fire. I hurled it at the men, the sparks flying as it hit the one with the rifle. Chaos erupted. Sarah scooped up Lily and bolted for the trees, Ethan right behind her. I heard the crack of the rifle, the bullet whizzing past my ear as I dove to the side. Adrenaline surged through me as I scrambled to my feet and ran after my family. We plunged into the dark forest, branches whipping at our faces as we fled. I could hear the men crashing through the underbrush behind us, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror drove me forward. "This way," I gasped, veering off to the right. I had a vague idea of the terrain from our hike earlier, and I was desperately trying to lead us towards rougher ground where we might lose our pursuers. We stumbled through a shallow stream, the cold water shocking my system. Lily was crying softly, her face buried in Sarah's shoulder. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, but he kept pace, his face set with determination. The sound of pursuit seemed to fade slightly, and I dared to hope we might be gaining some distance. But then I heard a yelp behind me, and turned to see Ethan sprawled on the ground, clutching his ankle. "I tripped," he whimpered, trying to stand but collapsing again with a grimace of pain. My heart sank. We couldn't leave him, but staying put wasn't an option. I could hear the men getting closer again, their voices carrying through the night air. "I'll carry him," I said to Sarah. "You take Lily and keep going. There's a ravine about a half-mile ahead. Hide there and wait for us." Sarah's eyes widened with fear. "John, no, we can't split up." "We don't have a choice," I insisted, already lifting Ethan onto my back. "Go, we'll be right behind you." With one last anguished look, Sarah turned and ran, Lily clinging to her like a lifeline. I adjusted Ethan's weight and set off as fast as I could manage, my son's arms wrapped tightly around my neck. We hadn't gone far when I heard a shout much too close for comfort. "There they are!" A bullet splintered the trunk of a tree just inches from my head. I ducked and weaved, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Ethan buried his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. I spotted a dense thicket of bushes and made a split-second decision. "Hold on tight," I whispered to Ethan, then plunged into the undergrowth. The thorns tore at my clothes and skin, but I pressed on, burrowing as deep into the thicket as I could. We lay there, hardly daring to breathe, as the men's footsteps drew near. I could smell their sweat and hear their labored breathing as they paused just feet from our hiding spot. "Where'd they go?" one of them growled. "They can't have gotten far," another replied. The boy was limping. My arms tightened around Ethan, silently willing him to stay quiet. For what felt like an eternity, we remained frozen, every snapping twig or rustling leaf sending a jolt of terror through me. Finally, mercifully, the men moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited several more minutes before cautiously emerging from our thorny sanctuary. "You okay, buddy?" I asked Ethan, brushing leaves from his hair. He nodded bravely, though I could see the fear in his eyes. "Dad, who are those men? Why are they chasing us?" I wish I had a good answer for him. "I don't know, son," I said honestly. "But we're going to be okay. We just need to find Mom and Lily, then we'll get out of here." We set off again, moving as quietly as we could through the dark forest. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential danger. But gradually, I began to recognize landmarks from our earlier hike. We were getting close to the ravine where I'd told Sarah to hide. As we approached, I heard a faint whisper. "John? Ethan?" Relief flooded through me as Sarah and Lily emerged from behind a large boulder. We embraced fiercely, all of us shaking with a mixture of fear and gratitude at being reunited. But we couldn't afford to relax yet. Those men were still out there, and we were lost in the wilderness with no supplies and an injured child. We needed a plan. "There's a ranger station about 10 miles from here," I said, trying to recall the details of our map. "If we can make it there, we'll be safe." It was a daunting journey, especially in our condition. But as I looked at my family, tired, scared, but alive and together, I knew we had no choice. We had to try. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we set off. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just days ago now felt oppressive and dangerous. But with each step, we were moving closer to safety and further from the nightmare behind us. I didn't know if we'd make it. I didn't know if those men were still hunting us or what would happen if they caught up. But I did know one thing. I would do whatever it took to protect my family. We had survived the night against all odds, and somehow, some way, we would survive this too. As we walked, I realized that this ordeal had changed us all. The carefree family that had arrived in these woods was gone. In its place was something stronger, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. Whatever happened, we would face it together. And so we pressed on, into the unknown, clinging to hope and to each other. The moment I saw his thumb jutting out from the shadows, I knew I should have kept driving. But something, pity, curiosity, or just plain stupidity, made me slow down. Little did I know, I was about to pick up a nightmare. It had been a long day on the road. I was on my way back from a business trip, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming traffic. The radio kept me company, playing a mix of old rock songs and late-night talk shows. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a solitary figure standing on the shoulder. He was tall and thin, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. His thumb was outstretched, the universal sign of a hitchhiker. I'd passed dozens of hitchhikers in my life without a second thought, but something about this one made me pause. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the fact that we were miles from anywhere. Whatever the reason, I found myself easing onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop. The man approached my passenger window, and I rolled it down a crack. Up close, he looked to be in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and intense eyes that seemed to bore right through me. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. "Just up the road a ways," he replied, his voice surprisingly soft. "My car broke down a few miles back. Just need to get to the next town." I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door lock. Every instinct told me to drive away, to leave this stranger in my rearview mirror. But the rational part of my brain argued that I was being paranoid. He was just a guy down on his luck, right? "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger seat, his backpack nestled between his feet. As we pulled back onto the highway, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. "I'm John," I said, more to break the silence than out of any real desire to chat. "Mike," he replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio. I kept sneaking glances at Mike, trying to get a read on him. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white with tension. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, hoping to ease the tension. Mike shrugged. "Engine trouble. Been having problems with it for a while now." "That's tough," I sympathized. "At least you'll be able to get it looked at in the next town." He nodded but didn't respond. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable by the minute. As we passed a sign indicating the next town was still 30 miles away, Mike suddenly spoke up. "Mind if we take a little detour? There's a rest stop coming up. I could use a bathroom break." I hesitated. The idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere with this stranger didn't sit well with me, but refusing seemed paranoid and rude. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I could use some coffee anyway. We pulled into the rest stop a few minutes later. It was deserted, the vending machines and restrooms islands of light in the darkness. As Mike got out of the car, I noticed him grab his backpack. Something about the way he clutched it made my skin prickle. "I'll just be a minute," he said, heading towards the restrooms. I watched him go, then got out to stretch my legs. The night air was cool, a welcome change from the stuffiness of the car. I walked over to the vending machines, fishing some change out of my pocket for a coffee. As I waited for my drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mike had been gone for a while now, too long for a simple bathroom break. I glanced towards the restrooms, half expecting to see him emerging, but there was no sign of him. Curiosity and unease warred within me. Part of me wanted to get in the car and drive away, leaving whatever was going on far behind. But another part, the part that had made me stop in the first place, wouldn't let me leave without knowing. I approached the restroom cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. "Mike?" I called out. "Oh, everything okay in there?" No response. I pushed open the door, the hinges creaking ominously. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows. The stalls were empty. Mike was gone. My heart began to race. Had he run off? But why? And where to? In the middle of nowhere? That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper tucked under the soap dispenser. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. "I'm sorry," it read in hasty scrawl. "They're after me. I had to use you as cover. Check your trunk." Ice flooded my veins. I sprinted back to my car, fumbling with the keys. The trunk popped open, and I recoiled at what I saw. Bundles of cash, stacks and stacks of it, and underneath, a gun. My mind reeled. What had I gotten myself into? Who was Mike, really, and who was after him? The sound of approaching engines snapped me back to reality. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly closer. Without thinking, I slammed the trunk shut and jumped into the driver's seat. My tires squealed as I peeled out of the rest stop, my heart pounding in my ears. In my rearview mirror, I saw two black SUVs pull into the rest stop. They paused only momentarily before resuming their pursuit. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, the engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. The speedometer crept past 90, then 100, but the SUVs kept pace. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I weaved through traffic, narrowly avoiding collisions. Questions raced through my mind. Was Mike some kind of criminal? A thief? Or was he running from something more sinister? And what would happen to me if these people caught up? I took an exit ramp at the last second, hoping to lose my pursuers, but they were relentless, matching my every move. I found myself on a winding back road, trees looming on either side. The SUVs were gaining, their headlights filling my mirrors. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing as I fought for control. As I skidded to a stop, I realized with a jolt that it was Mike. He ran to the car, yanking open the passenger door. "Drive!" he yelled, jumping in. I hesitated for a split second, but the sound of screeching tires behind us made the decision for me. I floored it, the tires spinning on the asphalt before finding purchase. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. Mike was rummaging in his backpack. He pulled out another gun, checking it with practiced ease. "I'm CIA," he said, his eyes scanning the road behind us. "Deep cover. Those guys back there, they're not the good guys." My mind struggled to process this information. "The money in my trunk?" "Evidence," he replied grimly. "Enough to bring down a major criminal organization, but they found out I was onto them. Been running ever since." The SUVs were closing in again. I heard the crack of gunfire, and my rear window exploded in a shower of glass. Mike leaned out the window, returning fire. "There's a safe house about 10 miles from here," Mike shouted over the noise. "If we can make it there, we'll be okay." I nodded, too focused on driving to form words. We careened around corners, the car's suspension groaning in protest. The gunfire was constant now, bullets pinging off the metal around us. As we rounded a bend, I saw salvation, a bridge spanning a deep ravine. On the other side, barely visible in the darkness, was a cluster of buildings, the safe house. "Almost there," Mike yelled. "Don't stop for anything." We were halfway across the bridge, when I heard a massive explosion behind us. In the rearview mirror, I saw one of the SUVs flip, engulfed in flames. The other swerved to avoid it, crashing into the guardrail. We made it across, skidding to a stop in front of a nondescript building. Mike was out of the car in an instant, shouting something I couldn't make out. Armed men emerged from the building, quickly surrounding us. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a truck. I sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel, as Mike talked urgently with the other agents. Eventually, he came back to the car. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentler than I'd heard it all night. I nodded numbly. "What happens now?" "Now, you're a hero," he said with a small smile. "You helped bring down a major criminal operation, but for your safety, we'll need to keep you here for a while, just until we tie up all the loose ends." As I followed Mike into the building, my mind was still reeling. In the span of a few hours, my life had been turned upside down. I'd gone from a simple businessman to an unwitting accomplice in an international sting operation. But as the door closed behind us, sealing us off from the chaos outside, I felt an odd sense of calm. I'd faced death and come out the other side. Whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. After all, I'd already survived the ride of my life. The moment I saw that blue minivan cruise past my house for the third time, I knew something was terribly wrong. What I didn't know was that my quest for a second-hand stroller would lead me into a nightmarish game of cat and mouse. It all started innocently enough. I'd recently given birth to my daughter, Emma, and like many new parents, I was feeling the financial pinch. Diapers, formula, and all the other baby essentials were eating into our budget faster than I'd anticipated. So when I needed a stroller, I turned to Craigslist, hoping to score a good deal on a gently used model. After scrolling through countless listings, I found what seemed perfect, a high-end stroller in great condition for a fraction of the retail price. The seller, Susan, lived just a few neighborhoods over. We arranged to meet at her apartment the next day. Susan's place was in a part of town I didn't know well. The buildings were older, a bit run down, but I reminded myself not to judge. As I climbed the creaky stairs to her third-floor apartment, I hugged Emma closer to my chest, suddenly feeling a bit uneasy. But Susan turned out to be perfectly pleasant, a smiling woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and a soft voice. She cooed over Emma while showing me the stroller, which was indeed in excellent condition. "I'm just glad it's going to a good home," Susan said as I counted out the cash. My daughter outgrew it so quickly. We chatted for a bit about the joys and challenges of motherhood. Before I left, she even gave me a bag of baby clothes her daughter had outgrown. I left feeling like I'd not only gotten a great deal, but maybe made a new mom friend. That evening, as I was putting Emma to bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Susan. "Hope you got home safely. Enjoy the stroller." I thought it was a nice gesture, if a bit unnecessary. I sent back a quick thanks and thought nothing more of it. But over the next few days, I started noticing things. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. A car that looked like Susan's parked down the street from our house. A glimpse of someone who resembled her at the grocery store, quickly disappearing down another aisle when I looked again. I told myself I was being paranoid. Lack of sleep and new mom anxiety were playing tricks on my mind. But then came the blue minivan. I first noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the front yard pushing Emma in her new stroller when it drove by slowly. The driver, a man I didn't recognize, seemed to be looking right at us. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Just a coincidence, I told myself. An hour later, it passed by again. This time, I was sure the driver was watching us. When it came around a third time, my heart began to race. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I confided in my husband, Mark. "I think someone's watching us," I said, feeling slightly ridiculous even as the words left my mouth. Mark listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Honey, you're exhausted," he said gently. "Your mind is probably just playing tricks on you. Why would anyone be watching us?" I wanted to believe him, but the next day, as I was coming back from a walk with Emma, I saw Susan. She was across the street, partially hidden behind a tree, watching my house. When she saw me notice her, she quickly walked away. Now I was sure something was wrong. I called the non-emergency police line, but they weren't much help. Without any concrete evidence of a threat, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to keep a record of any suspicious activities and call 911 if I ever felt in immediate danger. Over the next week, the sightings continued. The blue minivan, glimpses of Susan. Once, I even got a text from an unknown number. "Your baby is beautiful. Her eyes are so bright." I was a nervous wreck. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. I triple-checked the locks on our doors and windows every night. Mark was becoming worried, suggesting that maybe I should talk to someone about postpartum anxiety. But I knew this was real. I could feel eyes on me constantly, watching, waiting. But for what? The answer came on a rainy Thursday night. Mark was working late, and I was home alone with Emma. As I was washing dishes, I heard a noise from the baby monitor, a creak that didn't sound like Emma stirring in her crib. My heart in my throat. I crept upstairs. As I approached the nursery, I heard whispers. I peered around the doorframe and saw a sight that turned my blood to ice. Susan was there, leaning over Emma's crib, reaching for my baby. Without thinking, I burst into the room. "Get away from her!" I screamed. Susan whirled around, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the only sound Emma's confused whimpers. "I'm sorry," Susan said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I had to see her, to hold her." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, moving to stand between her and the crib. "Why are you in my house? Why have you been following me?" Tears welled up in Susan's eyes. "My baby," she whispered. "I lost my baby. She looks so much like your Emma. I couldn't let go." The pieces started to fall into place. The stroller that was barely used, the baby clothes, Susan's obsession with my daughter. A wave of pity washed over me, quickly replaced by fear and anger. "You need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now, before I call the police." Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. As she turned to go, she looked back at Emma one last time. The longing in her eyes was painful to see, but I stood my ground. After she left, I called the police. They came and took my statement, promising to look into Susan and advise her to stay away. They also suggested I get a restraining order, just to be safe. In the days that followed, I learned more about Susan's story. She had indeed lost a baby, just a few months earlier. The grief had apparently driven her to fixate on Emma as a replacement. The man in the blue minivan turned out to be her brother, who had been trying to keep an eye on her, worried about her mental state. It took a long time for me to feel safe again. We installed a security system, and I went to therapy to deal with the anxiety the ordeal had caused. Gradually, life returned to something resembling normal, but I never forgot the lesson I learned, that sometimes the greatest dangers can come from the most unexpected places, that a simple act of kindness, selling a used stroller to a fellow mom, could open the door to a nightmare. Now, years later, I still think about Susan sometimes. I hope she got the help she needed. And while I'm more cautious now, I try not to let fear rule my life. After all, Emma is growing up fast, and I don't want to miss a moment of it worrying about what might be lurking in the shadows. As I watch Emma play in our backyard, her laughter ringing out in the summer air, I'm reminded of how precious and fragile life can be. And I'm grateful, not just for her safety, but for the strength I found within myself during those terrifying days. It's a strength I carry with me always, ready for whatever challenges life might bring next. The moment I saw Nurse Samantha slip those vials into her purse, I knew I was in for the longest night shift of my life. What I didn't know was that it would also be the most dangerous. My name's Mike, and I've been working as a janitor at St. Andrew's Hospital for almost a year now. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and most nights, it's pretty quiet. I do my rounds, mop the floors, empty the trash, and generally keep the place tidy for the day shift. Nothing too exciting. That all changed on a Tuesday night in October. I remember it clearly because it was unseasonably cold, and I'd forgotten my jacket at home. I was shivering as I pushed my cart down the dimly lit corridors of the third floor, the wheels squeaking slightly with each turn. It was around 3 a.m. when I first noticed something off. Nurse Samantha, one of the night shift regulars, was acting strange near the supply closet. Now, Samantha had always been a bit intense. She was a big woman, tough as nails, with a reputation for being volatile. Most of the staff gave her a wide berth. But this was different. She kept glancing around nervously, checking over her shoulder as she fumbled with the door lock. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly wheeled my cart closer, pretending to be engrossed in wiping down a handrail. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Samantha carefully opened the closet and began removing vials of medication, stashing them in her bag. This wasn't just grabbing an extra Band-Aid or some gauze. These were serious drugs, the kind kept under lock and key. I froze, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, but another part, the part that valued my safety, told me to keep quiet. Samantha was a big woman, and I'd seen her lose her temper before. Plus, if she was stealing drugs, who knew what else she might be capable of? I decided to keep my head down and observe. For the rest of my shift, I kept a discreet eye on Samantha. She moved from room to room, administering medications as usual. But every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, she'd slip something into her pocket or purse. As the night wore on, my anxiety grew. I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. Patient lives could be at stake. But how could I expose her without putting myself in danger? Around 4 a.m., I saw my chance. Samantha disappeared into the supply closet again. This time, I positioned myself nearby, pretending to mop the floor. When she emerged, I could see her bag was bulging, the outline of vials visible through the fabric. I took a deep breath and decided to confront her. "Samantha," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw what you were doing in the supply closet." She froze, her eyes narrowing as they met mine. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her tone defensive. "I saw you taking medication," I replied, fighting to keep my voice low. "You're smuggling drugs out of here." Her face turned red with anger. Before I could react, she lunged forward, grabbing me by the collar of my uniform. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "Mind your own business." I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Samantha was unpredictable, and I knew I had to tread carefully. "I'm not going to let this go," I said firmly. "I have to report it." Her grip tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. But then she let go, shoving me backward. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance. "If you say anything," she growled, "I'll make sure you regret it." With that, she stormed off, leaving me shaken and unsure of what to do next. I knew I couldn't just let this slide, but I was terrified of what Samantha might do if I reported her. For the next hour, I went about my duties in a daze, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting Samantha to jump out at me. My mind raced with possible scenarios. What if she cornered me in a deserted part of the hospital? What if she had accomplices? As dawn approached, I made my decision. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. What if a patient got the wrong medication or not enough because of Samantha's theft? I had to do something. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone in the janitorial closet and dialed the hospital administrator's emergency line. To my relief, Dr. Patel, one of the senior physicians, answered. "Dr. Patel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to report something. It's about Nurse Samantha. She's been stealing medication from the supply closet. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's a serious accusation, Mike, Dr. Patel said gravely. Are you sure about this? I recounted what I'd seen, my voice growing steadier as I spoke. Dr. Patel listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions. All right, Mike, he said finally. You did the right thing by reporting this. Stay where you are. I'm coming down there now, and we'll handle this together. The next few minutes felt like hours as I waited for Dr. Patel. Every sound made me jump, convinced it was Samantha coming to confront me. When Dr. Patel finally arrived, accompanied by 2 security guards, I nearly wept with relief. We found Samantha in the break room, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Her face drained of color when she saw us enter. Samantha, Dr. Patel said, his voice firm but calm, we need to talk about some missing medication. What happened next was a blur. Samantha tried to run, but the security guards blocked her path. As they restrained her, her bag fell to the floor, spilling out dozens of vials and syringes. The evidence was undeniable. Samantha broke down, alternating between sobbing and shouting threats at me. As the security guards led her away, Dr. Patel put a hand on my shoulder. You did a brave thing, Mike, he said. You may have saved lives today. In the days that followed, the full extent of Samantha's theft came to light. She'd been stealing drugs for months, selling them on the street to feed her own addiction. The hospital implemented stricter security measures, and I was commended for my bravery. But the experience left its mark on me. For weeks, I jumped at every shadow, convinced Samantha or one of her contacts might come seeking revenge. I considered quitting, finding a job where the most dangerous thing I might encounter was a slippery floor. But then I remembered Dr. Patel's words. I had made a difference. I had potentially saved lives. And that thought gave me the courage to keep going. Now, months later, I still work the night shift at St. Andrews. The halls are quiet once again, but I approach my job with a new sense of purpose. I'm not just keeping the floors clean, I'm keeping an eye out, staying vigilant. Because I learned something important that night. In a hospital, every role is crucial. From the surgeons to the janitors, we're all part of a team dedicated to saving lives and keeping patients safe. And sometimes, that means having the courage to speak up, even when it's scary. As I push my cart down the corridor, the wheels squeaking softly in the night, I feel a sense of pride. I'm not just a janitor. I'm a guardian, a protector of this healing place. And if another Samantha ever shows up, well, I'll be ready. The night shift may be long, and at times it may be dangerous. But it's my shift, my responsibility, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The moment I saw the envelope slip under my hotel room door, my heart stopped. In a foreign country, with no money, no ID, and a growing sense that I was being hunted, that innocent-looking piece of paper might as well have been a ticking bomb. I'd always dreamed of traveling the world. When I finally saved up enough for a solo trip to Greece, I thought I was embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. Little did I know, it would turn into a nightmare that would test every ounce of my strength and wit. The first few days in Athens were everything I'd hoped for. I explored the Acropolis, savored authentic Greek cuisine, and lost myself in the vibrant streets of Plaka. The city was a sensory overload in the best possible way, and I fell in love with its blend of ancient history and modern energy. On my 4th night, I returned to my small hotel room, exhausted but exhilarated from a day of sightseeing. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something was off. My bag, which I distinctly remembered leaving on the chair, was now on the floor. At first, I brushed it off as faulty memory, but when I checked inside, my stomach dropped. My wallet, passport, and phone were gone. Panic set in immediately. I was alone in a foreign country with no way to prove who I was or contact anyone for help. I rushed to the hotel reception, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. The receptionist looked concerned and called the local police for me. The officers who arrived took my statement, but I could tell from their expressions that they didn't hold out much hope. Thefts like this were common, they explained, especially in tourist areas. They advised me to go to the American Embassy in the morning to get a temporary passport. That night was one of the longest of my life. I barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway, convinced the thief might return. When morning finally came, I made my way to the embassy, my nerves frayed and my spirit dampened. The embassy staff were sympathetic but bureaucratic. They took my details and said it would take a few days to process everything. In the meantime, they provided me with some emergency cash and helped me find a cheaper hostel to stay in while I waited. As I settled into my new, more Spartan accommodations, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the theft. There was something more sinister at play. I kept catching glimpses of people watching me. A man in a dark suit at a cafe across the street. A woman who seemed to be following me through the market. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the situation was making me imagine things. But then came the envelope. I had just returned to my room after another frustrating day of waiting for news from the embassy. The plain white envelope lay there on the floor, innocuous yet terrifying. With trembling hands, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Stay away. This is your only warning." My blood ran cold. What did it mean? Stay away from what? Who was warning me? And why? I called the front desk immediately, explaining about the envelope. They assured me they would take it seriously and increase security measures. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old hostel made me jump. I kept imagining footsteps outside my door, shadows moving under the crack. When morning finally came, I was a wreck. I decided I couldn't stay in my room feeling like a sitting duck. I needed to be around people, to feel some semblance of safety. I went down to the lobby, planning to camp out there for the day. As I sat in a worn armchair, pretending to read a book while actually scanning every person who entered, I noticed a man watching me. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair, and a face that looked like it had seen too much sun. When he realized I had spotted him, he approached. "American?" he asked in a thick accent I couldn't place. I nodded warily, my body tensing for flight. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're in danger. They think you have something that belongs to them." Before I could ask who they were or what they thought I had, he was gone, melting into the crowd outside the hostel doors. My mind raced. Was this connected to the theft? Had I somehow stumbled into something bigger than a simple robbery? I felt like I was in the middle of a spy thriller, except this was terrifyingly real. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every stranger on the street became a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. As night fell, I knew I couldn't go back to my room. It didn't feel safe anymore. I walked the streets of Athens, moving from one 24-hour cafe to another, never staying in one place too long. The city that had seemed so magical just days ago now felt oppressive and dangerous. Around midnight, I saw them, two men in dark clothes, moving with purpose through the thinning crowds. They were scanning faces, and I knew instinctively they were looking for me. I ducked into a narrow alleyway, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they would hear it. I heard their footsteps at the entrance of the alley. "She must have gone this way," one of them said in Greek-accented English. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. They were so close I could smell the cigarette smoke on their clothes. Just when I thought they would discover me, a cat knocked over a trash can further down the alley. The noise startled them, and they moved past my hiding spot to investigate. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. As soon as they were out of sight, I ran. I had no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I found myself near the ancient agora. The ruins stood silent in the moonlight, a reminder of a civilization that had endured far greater challenges than what I was facing. Somehow, that thought gave me strength. I spent the rest of the night moving from shadow to shadow, always alert, always watching. As dawn broke, I made my way back to the American embassy. I didn't know if I could trust them, but I had nowhere else to turn. To my surprise, there was already someone waiting for me. The salt and pepper-haired man from the hostel. He flashed a badge identifying him as an Interpol agent. "We've been watching you," he said, his tone softer than I expected. "You unknowingly checked into a hotel that's a front for a major counterfeiting operation. They thought you were one of us." The relief I felt at finally understanding what was happening was overwhelming. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. The danger had been real. The next few days were a whirlwind. I gave statements to Interpol and the local police. My stolen belongings were recovered, minus the cash. The Interpol agent, whose name was Dmitri, explained that the theft had been a standard tactic to keep tourists quiet about what they might have seen in the hotel. As I finally boarded my flight home, my emotions were mixed. I was relieved to be safe, but also strangely exhilarated. I had faced my worst fears and survived. I had been alone in a foreign country, hunted and afraid, and I had made it through. The Greece I was leaving wasn't the Greece I had arrived to see. The romantic notions of ancient ruins and Mediterranean beaches had been replaced by a grittier, more complex reality. But I was leaving with something far more valuable than tourist snapshots. I was leaving with a newfound confidence in my own resilience. As the plane took off, I looked out at the twinkling lights of Athens below. I knew that somewhere down there, life was going on as usual. Tourists were exploring the Acropolis, locals were enjoying late-night souvlaki, and yes, probably some criminals were plotting their next move. But I was different now. I had seen the darker side of travel, and I had survived it. Whatever challenges lay ahead in my normal life back home, I knew I could face them. After all, they couldn't be scarier than being hunted through the streets of a foreign city, right? As Greece faded into the distance, I smiled to myself. This might not have been the trip I planned, but it was certainly one I would never forget. And isn't that, after all, what travel is all about? The moment I saw his eyes in the flickering lamplight, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The man I'd rescued from the churning sea wasn't a victim of the storm. He was its human embodiment, and I'd just invited chaos into my sanctuary. I've been the keeper of the Morro Point Lighthouse for nearly 2 decades. It's a solitary life, but one I've grown to love. The rhythmic flash of the beacon, the crash of waves against the rocky shore, the cry of seagulls. These have been my constant companions. I've weathered countless storms from my perch high above the ocean, always feeling safe and secure within these sturdy stone walls. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. The storm had been raging for hours, one of the worst I'd seen in years. The wind howled like a banshee, rain lashed against the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. I was up in the lantern room, making sure the light stayed strong and true, when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Surely, no one could be out in that maelstrom. But there he was, a lone figure clinging to a piece of driftwood, being tossed about by the angry waves like a rag doll. My training kicked in immediately. I radioed the Coast Guard, but they were swamped with other emergencies and couldn't reach us for hours. I knew that by then, it would be too late. I've always prided myself on being a decent man, the kind who'd help a stranger in need. So, I did what any good lighthouse keeper would do. I went out to save him. The journey from the lighthouse to the shore was treacherous. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet several times, and the rain made it almost impossible to see. But somehow, I made it to the water's edge. I waded in, the icy waves slapping against my chest, threatening to pull me under. The man had drifted closer to shore, but he was clearly exhausted, barely hanging on. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to grab him and drag him onto the beach. He was a sorry sight, soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his eyes wild and unfocused. I helped him to his feet and half carried, half dragged him back to the lighthouse. Once inside, I sat him by the fire, wrapped him in blankets, and pressed a mug of hot tea into his trembling hands. It was only then, in the warm glow of the hearth, that I got a good look at him. He was younger than I'd first thought, probably in his early 30s. His face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. There was something unsettling about those eyes, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy from the salt water. "I thought I was done for out there." "What happened?" I asked. "How did you end up in the water?" He looked down at his mug, a shadow passing over his face. "My boat capsized. I was the only survivor." I nodded sympathetically, but something about his story didn't sit right. His clothes weren't those of a sailor, and he had no other signs of having been on a boat. No life jacket, no identifying tags, nothing. "I'm John," I said, trying to shake off my unease. "I'm the lighthouse keeper here." He looked up at me, those unsettling eyes boring into mine. "Martin," he replied simply. As the night wore on, Martin became more talkative. He asked questions about the lighthouse, about my life here, about the surrounding area. His interest seemed innocent enough, but there was an intensity to his queries that put me on edge. I tried to radio the Coast Guard again, but the storm was interfering with the signal. We were on our own, at least until morning. As I prepared a makeshift bed for Martin in the living quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake in bringing him here. But what choice did I have? I couldn't have left him to drown. I showed Martin to his room and retreated to my own, locking the door behind me, something I'd never felt the need to do before. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with doubts and fears. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke with a start to the sound of movement outside my door. The storm had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I glanced at my clock, 3:27 a.m. Quietly, I got up and pressed my ear to the door. Footsteps, moving stealthily down the hallway. I held my breath, listening intently. The steps paused outside my door for a moment, then continued on. My heart pounding, I cracked open the door and peered out. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw Martin's figure disappearing around the corner, heading towards the lantern room. I followed, trying to keep my footsteps silent on the metal stairs. As I reached the top, I heard Martin's voice. He was talking to someone, his tone urgent and low. "I'm in," he was saying. "The old fool bought my story hook. Line and sinker. We can move forward with the plan." I felt my blood run cold. Who was he talking to? What plan? I must have made a noise because suddenly, Martin fell silent. I barely had time to duck back down the stairs before he emerged from the lantern room. "John," he called out. "Is that you?" I didn't answer, my mind racing. I needed to get to my radio to call for help. But to do that, I'd have to get past Martin. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into view. "Just checking on you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thought I heard something up here." Martin's face was a mask of innocence, but his eyes, those burning eyes, told a different story. "Just admiring the view," he said smoothly. "It's quite something up here." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. We stood there in uncomfortable silence for a moment before I excused myself, saying I needed to check on something downstairs. As soon as I was out of sight, I raced to the radio room. My hands shook as I tried to establish a connection with the Coast Guard. "Mayday, Mayday," I whispered urgently into the mic. "This is Morrow Point Lighthouse. I need immediate assist." A hand clamped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. Martin stood there, all pretense of friendliness gone from his face. Now, John, he said, his voice cold and hard. We can't have you doing that. What followed was a desperate struggle. Despite my age, I'm still strong from years of maintaining the lighthouse. But Martin was younger, quicker, and driven by a manic energy I couldn't match. We crashed around the room, knocking over equipment and furniture. I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, but he retaliated by slamming my head against the wall, leaving me dazed. Through the fog of pain, I saw Martin pick up a heavy wrench from my toolbox. He raised it high, a look of grim determination on his face. I'm sorry it had to come to this, old man, he said, but I can't let you interfere. Just as he was about to bring the wrench down, a blinding light flooded the room. We both turned to see a Coast Guard helicopter hovering outside the window. Its searchlight trained directly on us. Martin's moment of distraction was all I needed. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. We grappled on the floor as shouts and footsteps thundered up the lighthouse stairs. Moments later, the room was filled with Coast Guard officers. They pulled Martin off me, quickly restraining him. As they led him away, I learned the truth. Martin was part of a smuggling ring that had been using remote lighthouses as drop-off points. They'd been planning to take over Morrow Point for months, seeing it as the perfect, isolated spot for their operations. The storm that had brought Martin to my door had been entirely manufactured, a ploy to gain entry to the lighthouse and overpower its solitary keeper. In the days that followed, as I nursed my bruises and gave statements to various law enforcement agencies, I couldn't help but reflect on how close I'd come to disaster. My desire to help, my basic human decency, had nearly been my undoing. But as I stood in the lantern room, watching the beams sweep out over the calm sea, I realized something. Yes, there was darkness in the world, men like Martin who would exploit kindness for their own gain. But there was also light. The Coast Guard who had come to my rescue, the officers who worked tirelessly to bring the smugglers to justice, even my own stubborn refusal to give in, these were all beacons of hope in their own way. I decided to stay on as keeper of Morrow Point. This lighthouse had been my home for too long to abandon it now, but I'd be more cautious in the future, more discerning about who I let into my sanctuary. As night fell and I lit the beacon once more, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was more than just a lighthouse keeper. I was a guardian, a protector of this small corner of the world. And come storm or smuggler, I would stand my ground. The light flashed out across the waves, strong and steady, and I stood watch, ready for whatever the night might bring. The moment he slid into my back seat, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary ride. There was something in his eyes, a wild, desperate look that sent a chill down my spine. Little did I know, I was about to become an unwitting accomplice in a night that would push me to my limits. I'd been driving for Uber for about 6 months, mostly to supplement my day job income. It was usually pretty uneventful. Drunk college kids, business people running late, tourists trying to cram in as many sights as possible. But this night was different from the start. It was around 2 a.m., that dead time when the bars have closed but the city hasn't quite woken up yet. I was thinking about calling it a night when the ping came through on my app. The pickup location was in a part of town I didn't know well, mostly abandoned warehouses and shuttered factories. I hesitated for a moment, my gut telling me to ignore it and head home. But the promise of one last fare won out, and I found myself navigating through the maze of darkened streets. As I pulled up to the address, I saw him, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, standing in the shadow of a graffiti-covered wall. He was looking around nervously, like he expected someone to jump out at him at any moment. "You the Uber," he called out as I approached. I nodded, forcing a smile. "That's me. Where are we headed tonight?" He didn't answer immediately, just slid into the back seat and shut the door. The car filled with the smell of sweat and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. Just drive, he said, his voice low and tense. I'll give you directions as we go. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to kick this guy out and speed away, but I was already moving, merging back onto the empty street. We drove in silence for a while, the man occasionally muttering directions. We were heading out of the city, towards the more rural outskirts. The buildings grew sparse, replaced by fields and the occasional farmhouse. So, I said, trying to break the tension, late night or early morning for you? He grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the side mirror. You always this chatty? I shut up after that, focusing on the road ahead. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional ping from my phone. After about 20 minutes, he suddenly barked, "Pull over here." We were in the middle of nowhere, a dirt road stretching out on either side of us. There was nothing around except for an old, dilapidated barn about 100 yards off the road. "Look, man," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what's going on here, but shut up and listen." He cut me off. For the first time, I saw something glint in his hand, a knife. My blood ran cold. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "You're going to wait here. I'm going to take care of some business in that barn. When I come back, you're going to drive me back to the city. No questions asked. Got it?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. "Good," he said. "And just so we're clear, if you try to leave or call anyone, things will get very unpleasant for you. Understand?" Another nod. He got out of the car and walked towards the barn, disappearing into the shadows. As soon as he was out of sight, I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My mind was racing. What had I gotten myself into? Was this guy a drug dealer? A killer? Should I try to make a run for it? I looked at my phone. No signal, of course. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. I kept expecting to hear gunshots or screams, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I saw movement by the barn. The man was coming back, and he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him, stumbling along like they were injured or drugged. As they got closer, I could see it was a woman. Her hands were tied behind her back, and there was a gag in her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This wasn't just some shady deal. This was a kidnapping, and I was in the middle of it. The man shoved the woman into the back seat, then got in beside her. "Drive," he commanded. I put the car in gear, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As we pulled away, I caught the woman's eye in the rearview mirror. The fear and desperation I saw there made my decision for me. I had to do something. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when I saw my chance. Up ahead was a sharp bend in the road, with a steep drop-off on one side. I took a deep breath, sent up a silent prayer, and made my move. As we approached the turn, I suddenly jerked the wheel hard to the right. The car skidded, tires squealing on the asphalt. The man yelled, caught off guard. Before he could react, I slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park. In the moment of chaos, I scrambled out of the driver's seat and yanked open the back door. The woman tumbled out, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her with me as I ran. I could hear the man shouting behind us, the sound of his footsteps getting closer. We ran towards a dense patch of trees, the uneven ground making us stumble. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The man had a gun. The woman stumbled, letting out a muffled cry through her gag. I pulled her behind a large tree, both of us breathing hard. Come out, the man called, his voice echoing in the night. "You're only making this worse for yourselves." I looked at the woman, trying to convey with my eyes that she should stay quiet. Slowly, carefully, I untied her hands and removed the gag. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Another shot rang out, closer this time. We flinched, pressing ourselves against the tree trunk. I have an idea, I whispered back, but it's risky. She nodded, willing to try anything. I picked up a large rock and threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction. The sound of it crashing through the underbrush caught the man's attention. We heard him moving away from us, towards the noise. Now, I hissed. We ran, no longer caring about being quiet. Our only hope was to get back to the road to find help. We burst out of the tree line, the road just ahead of us, and there, like a miracle, was a pair of headlights approaching. I waved my arms frantically, yelling at the top of my lungs. The car slowed, then stopped. It was an old pickup truck, driven by a bewildered-looking elderly man. "Please," I gasped. "We need help. There's a man with a gun." Before I could finish, another shot rang out. The old man's eyes widened in fear, but to his credit, he didn't drive off. Instead, he reached over and flung open the passenger door. "Get in," he yelled. We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the truck, the woman practically in my lap in the cramped cab. As we sped off, I saw the man emerge from the trees in my side mirror, his face contorted with rage. The old man, who introduced himself as Frank, drove us straight to the nearest police station. The next few hours were a blur of statements and questions. The woman, whose name was Lisa, had been kidnapped by the man, her ex-husband, who had been stalking her for months. As dawn broke, I sat on a bench outside the police station, exhausted but relieved. Lisa came out and sat beside me. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." I shook my head. "I'm just glad we both made it out okay." She squeezed my hand, and we sat there in silence, watching the sun rise on a new day. In the weeks that followed, I gave more statements, identified the man in a lineup, and eventually testified at his trial. He went away for a long time. I stopped driving for Uber after that night. The experience had shown me how quickly an ordinary situation could turn dangerous, but it had also shown me something about myself, that when pushed to the limit, I was capable of more courage than I ever thought possible. Now, whenever I see an Uber drive by, I say a little prayer for the driver and their passengers, because you never know when a simple ride might turn into the most harrowing journey of your life. I never thought a garden gnome could be a harbinger of terror, but as I stared at the ceramic figure mysteriously placed on my porch, its painted eyes seeming to follow my every move, I realized my quiet life in this small town was about to take a sinister turn. My name's Sarah, and I moved to Millbrook about 6 months ago. After years of hustling in the big city, I was ready for a change of pace. Millbrook seemed perfect, a quaint rural town where everyone knew their neighbors and life moved at a slower rhythm. I bought a charming little house on the outskirts of town, with a spacious yard that I dreamed of turning into a vegetable garden. The first few months were idyllic. I spent my days working remotely from my sunny home office, and my evenings tending to my budding garden or chatting with neighbors over the fence. One neighbor in particular, Tom, seemed especially friendly. He lived in the house next door, a middle-aged man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and an easy smile. He was always offering to help with yard work or home repairs, which I appreciated as a single woman living alone. It was Tom who first pointed out the gnome. I was watering my tomato plants one evening when he called over the fence. "Hey, Sarah, when did you get the new garden decoration?" I looked up, confused. "What decoration?" He pointed to my front porch. "The gnome. Cute little fella." I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't bought any gnome. Excusing myself, I walked around to the front of the house. There it was, a typical garden gnome, about a foot tall, with a red hat and a cheerful expression, but something about it felt off. I picked it up gingerly, looking for any clue as to where it came from. There was nothing. No tag, no marking, nothing. Just smooth, cold ceramic. Probably just a welcome gift from one of the neighbors. I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I placed the gnome back on the porch and went inside, determined to forget about it. But I couldn't. That night, I kept waking up, sure I had heard something moving outside. Each time I looked out the window, the gnome was there, its fixed smile visible in the moonlight. The next morning, I woke up exhausted and on edge. As I stumbled to the kitchen to make coffee, I glanced out the front window and froze. The gnome had moved. It was now facing the house, as if looking directly at me. My heart raced. I told myself I must have bumped it last night and not noticed, but deep down, I knew I hadn't touched it. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Every morning, the gnome would be in a different position. Sometimes it would be facing a different direction. Sometimes it would be in a completely new spot in the yard. I started taking pictures, trying to convince myself I wasn't going crazy. I thought about talking to Tom about it, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way he had been watching me lately, his friendly smile not quite reaching his eyes. Or maybe it was the fact that I had seen him outside at odd hours, always seeming to be looking towards my house. A week after the gnome appeared, I came home from grocery shopping to find my front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it, I always did. Heart pounding, I entered the house, half expecting to find an intruder. Everything looked normal, but there was a faint smell I didn't recognize, a mix of cigarette smoke and something metallic. I called the police in, but they found no signs of forced entry. They suggested I might have forgotten to lock the door, or that perhaps a draft had blown it open. I nodded and thanked them, but I knew better. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. When my alarm went off in the morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Bleary-eyed, I went to make coffee and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on my kitchen table, was the gnome. Its cheerful smile now seemed sinister, mocking. I backed away, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. I never brought the gnome inside. Someone had been in my house, in my safe space. With shaking hands, I called my best friend Lisa. "I need you to come over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's wrong." Lisa arrived within the hour, concern etched on her face. I told her everything, the appearing gnome, the strange movements, the unlocked door, and now this. To her credit, she didn't dismiss me or tell me I was imagining things. "Have you noticed anything else unusual?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I hesitated, then told her about Tom, his over-friendliness, the odd hours, the feeling of being watched. Lisa's eyes widened. "Sarah, this isn't just paranoia. Someone is definitely messing with you. We need to call the police again." This time, the police took my concerns more seriously. They dusted for fingerprints and found several that didn't match mine. They promised to increase patrols in the area and suggested I install security cameras. Lisa stayed with me that night, and we spent hours setting up cameras around the house and yard. We moved the gnome to the backyard, placing it where it would be clearly visible on the cameras. The next morning, we reviewed the footage. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at around 3 a.m., a figure appeared on the screen. My heart stopped as I recognized Tom's silhouette. We watched in horror as he crept around the yard, eventually picking up the gnome and moving it to the front porch. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered. "Oh, Sarah, he's been gaslighting you this whole time." I felt sick. All those friendly interactions, the offers of help. It had all been a ploy to get close to me, to learn my routines. We called the police immediately. They arrived quickly, reviewed the footage, and went to Tom's house with a warrant. What they found there chilled me to the bone. Tom's house was filled with pictures of me, sleeping, working in my garden, even through my windows. He had been obsessively stalking me for months. The police also found detailed plans about how he intended to make me his. As they led Tom away in handcuffs, he looked at me with a mixture of anger and something that looked unsettlingly like love. "We were meant to be together," he called out. "I was just trying to protect you." In the days that followed, I learned more about Tom's history. He had a record of stalking women in other towns, always moving on before he could be caught. Millbrook had been his latest hunting ground, and I had been his target. The gnome, it turned out, was his sick way of playing with me. He got a thrill out of making me question my sanity, of invading my space without me knowing. Each move of the gnome was a message. I can get to you anytime I want. It took a long time for me to feel safe in my home again. I installed better locks, got a security system, and even adopted a large dog. Lisa stayed with me for a few weeks, helping me process what had happened. Slowly, life in Millbrook returned to normal, or a new normal at least. My neighbors, horrified by what had happened, rallied around me. They checked in regularly, helped me reinforce my house, and made sure I was never alone if I didn't want to be. As for the gnome, I couldn't bring myself to keep it. Instead, I decided to turn it into something positive. I donated it to a local art project that raised awareness about stalking and domestic violence. Seeing it transformed, broken apart, and reformed into a beautiful mosaic helped me start to heal. Today, a year after that terrifying ordeal, I'm still in Millbrook. I've reclaimed my home and my peace of mind. My garden is thriving, and I've made genuine friendships with my neighbors. But I'll never forget the lesson I learned, that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing a friendly smile and offering a helping hand, and that a seemingly innocuous object, like a garden gnome, can be a silent sentinel of terror. Every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear the faint sound of ceramic scraping against wood. In those moments, I take a deep breath, remind myself that I'm safe and that the nightmare is over. But I always check my locks, just in case. The moment I heard the first gunshot echo through the forest, I knew our camping trip had just become a fight for survival. What started as a peaceful getaway with friends had suddenly turned into a nightmare, and the woods that once seemed welcoming now felt like a deadly maze. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. My best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and my boyfriend Tom had been planning this camping trip to the Adirondacks for months. We were all desperate to escape the noise and stress of the city, to reconnect with nature and each other. If only we'd known what was waiting for us in those seemingly peaceful woods. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the tall pines. The drive had been long, but the excitement of the adventure ahead kept our spirits high. We found a beautiful spot to set up camp, far from the designated campgrounds. Jake had insisted on going off the beaten path, saying it would give us a more authentic experience. None of us thought to argue. Setting up camp was a breeze. Jake and Tom handled the tents while Sarah and I gathered firewood. As darkness fell, we sat around the crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The night sky above us was a blanket of stars, more than I'd ever seen in my light-polluted city life. It was breathtaking. "This is perfect," Sarah sighed, leaning her head on Jake's shoulder. "We should do this more often." We all murmured in agreement, feeling content and at peace. If only we'd known it was the calm before the storm. The next day, we decided to go for a hike. Jake had found a trail on his map that led to a secluded waterfall. "It'll be a bit of a trek," he said, "but the view will be worth it." We set off early, the morning dew still clinging to the leaves. The hike was challenging but exhilarating. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, the air fresh and invigorating. We stopped occasionally to take photos or admire particularly beautiful vistas. It was around midday when we reached the waterfall. Jake had been right. It was stunning. Crystal clear water cascaded down moss-covered rocks into a serene pool below. We decided to take a break, eat our packed lunches, and maybe even take a dip in the cool water. That's when we heard it, voices carrying on the wind. At first, we thought it might be other hikers, but as the voices got closer, we realized something was off. The tones were angry, aggressive. "We need to hide," Tom whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we gathered our things and ducked behind some large boulders near the water's edge. From our hiding spot, we could see a group of men emerge from the trees on the other side of the clearing. They were rough-looking, carrying rifles and speaking in hushed, angry tones. "This is our territory," one of them growled. "We need to send a message to those city folks, show them they're not welcome here." My blood ran cold. Were they talking about us? How did they know we were from the city? We stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, as the men continued their discussion. It became clear that they were some kind of local militia group, angry about outsiders coming into their woods. They talked about setting up traps, about teaching lessons to trespassers. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, the men moved on. We waited until we couldn't hear their voices anymore before we dared to move. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Right now." No one argued. We began to make our way back down the trail, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just hours ago now felt oppressive and dangerous. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every rustle in the underbrush could be a threat. We were about halfway back to our campsite when we heard the first gunshot. It rang out loud and clear, followed by shouts and more gunfire. "Run!" Jake yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. We took off, all thoughts of stealth forgotten in our panic. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the undergrowth, the sound of pursuit growing closer behind us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green blur of the forest. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Suddenly, Jake stumbled, crying out in pain. He'd twisted his ankle on a hidden root. Tom and I grabbed him, supporting him between us as we continued to move, slower now but still driven by desperation. We found a dense thicket and ducked into it, helping Jake sit down. Sarah worked to bandage his ankle with supplies from the small first aid kit she carried, while Tom and I kept watch. "What are we going to do?" Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. "We need to get back to the campsite," Tom said. "Get our phones, call for help." "But what if they're waiting for us there?" I asked, the thought sending a fresh wave of panic through me. Before anyone could answer, we heard voices nearby. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. "They couldn't have gotten far," a gruff voice said. "The girl left a trail even a blind man could follow." I looked down in horror, realizing my shirt had torn on a branch, leaving behind small scraps of fabric. "We need to move," Jake whispered urgently. "They'll find us if we stay here." Despite his injured ankle, Jake insisted he could move. We helped him up, and once again we were on the run. But this time we moved more carefully, doing our best to leave no trail. As we crept through the forest, the sounds of our pursuers seemed to be all around us. A twig would snap to our left, voices would carry from the right. It was like we were caught in some twisted game of cat and mouse. Night began to fall, making our progress even slower. We were lost, exhausted, and terrified. But we kept moving, driven by the primal need to survive. It was Tom who spotted the cave. Hidden behind a curtain of vines, it seemed to offer a temporary sanctuary. We ducked inside, grateful for a moment's rest. "We can't keep running forever," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. "We need a plan." "I say we wait until full dark," Jake suggested. "Then try to circle back to the campsite. If we can get to our phones, we can call for help." It was a risky plan, but it was the only one we had. We settled in to wait, huddled together for warmth and comfort. Hours passed. The forest outside grew quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of a small animal. When we could no longer see anything beyond the cave entrance, we knew it was time to move. Our progress was painfully slow. Jake's ankle had swollen, making each step agony for him. We had to stop frequently to listen for any signs of pursuit. But somehow, miraculously, we made it back to our campsite. The sight that greeted us made my heart sink. Our tents had been slashed, our supplies scattered. It was clear the men had been here. "Quick," Tom whispered. "Grab anything useful and let's go." We worked fast, gathering what we could. I found my phone buried under some torn sleeping bags. The battery was low, but it was still working. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The next few hours were a blur. We kept moving, always on alert, as I tried to describe our location to the emergency dispatcher. When we finally heard the whir of helicopter blades, I nearly wept with relief. The forest rangers found us just as dawn was breaking. We were dehydrated, exhausted, and traumatized, but alive. As they led us to safety, we learned that the men who had been chasing us were part of a known anti-government group. They had been causing trouble in the area for months. In the days that followed, as we gave statements to the police and tried to process what had happened, I found myself reflecting on how quickly our peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare. The Adirondacks, which had seemed so beautiful and serene, had revealed a darker, more dangerous side. We had gone into those woods seeking adventure and connection. We had found those things, but not in the way we expected. Our brush with danger had bonded us in a way that no ordinary camping trip could have. We had seen each other at our most vulnerable, our most terrified, and we had pulled through together. As I sit here now, safe in my city apartment, I can still hear the echo of those gunshots, still feel the panic of being hunted through the darkness, but I also remember the strength we found in each other, the resilience we didn't know we had. Will I ever go camping again? I'm not sure, but I do know that whatever challenges life throws at me, I can face them. After all, I survived a night of terror in the Adirondacks. What could be scarier than that? The moment I saw their eyes in my rearview mirror, I knew I had stumbled into something far more sinister than a simple pit stop. What should have been a quick refuel had just become a desperate fight for survival, with an entire town seemingly intent on making sure I never left. It was supposed to be a straightforward road trip. I'd been driving for hours, making my way across the country to start a new job in California. The monotony of the highway had lulled me into a sense of security, the miles rolling by as I sang along to the radio and daydreamed about my fresh start. As the sun began to set, I noticed my gas gauge dipping dangerously low. I hadn't seen a station for miles, and the vast emptiness of the desert was starting to make me nervous. Just when I was beginning to worry, I spotted a sign, "Last Chance Gas, 5 miles." It wasn't a name I recognized, but beggars can't be choosers when you're running on fumes in the middle of nowhere. The exit ramp led me to a small, dusty town that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Faded storefronts lined the main street, their windows dark and uninviting. The gas station stood at the far end, its neon sign flickering weakly in the twilight. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed a group of locals gathered near the station's convenience store. They fell silent as I got out of my car, their eyes following my every move. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself I was just being paranoid. "Evening," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "You folks know if this place is still open?" One of the men, a tall, lean figure with a weather-beaten face, stepped forward. "Sure is," he drawled, his tone oddly flat. "Why don't you go on inside and see Mitch? He'll get you sorted." I nodded my thanks and headed into the store, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere outside. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered, shelves stocked with dusty cans and faded packages. Behind the counter stood a man I assumed was Mitch, his rheumy eyes regarding me with an unsettling intensity. "Just passing through?" he asked as I approached, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "Yeah, on my way to California," I replied, fishing out my wallet. "Could I get 40 on pump 3, please?" Mitch's eyes narrowed slightly. "California, huh? Long way from here. You sure you want to keep going tonight? We got a motel just down the road. Might be safer to rest up before hitting the road again." Something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Thanks, but I'm good to keep driving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just get that gas and be on my way." Mitch shrugged, but I could see a hardness in his eyes that wasn't there before. He rang up the purchase silently, and I couldn't help but notice how his gaze kept flicking to something behind me. I turned, half expecting to see someone there, but there was only the empty store. As I walked back to my car, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me. The group by the store had grown larger, and they made no effort to hide their stares. I kept my head down, focusing on the task of filling up my tank, willing the numbers to tick by faster. Just as I was finishing up, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned to see the tall man from earlier, flanked by two others. Their expressions were grim, almost predatory. "You know," the tall man said, his voice low and menacing, "we don't get many outsiders round here. Folks tend to get lost, if you catch my meaning." My heart began to race. I fumbled with the gas cap, trying to appear calm. "Well, I appreciate your concern, but I really should be going." I made to get into my car, but one of the other men stepped forward, blocking my path. "Now hold on there," he said, his meaty hand coming to rest on my car door. "We can't in good conscience let you drive off into the night. Why don't you come with us? We'll make sure you're taken care of." In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that if I went with these men, I would never be seen again. With a surge of adrenaline, I shoved past them and dove into my car, slamming the lock down just as hands grabbed for the door handle. I gunned the engine, tires squealing as I peeled out of the gas station. In my rearview mirror, I could see the men running to their trucks. The whole town seemed to come alive, lights flicking on in houses and more vehicles pulling onto the road behind me. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I accelerated, pushing my car to its limits. The desert night flew by in a blur, punctuated by the glare of headlights in my mirrors. I could hear engines roaring behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I took a sharp turn onto a side road, hoping to lose them, but they knew these roads far better than I did. Every twist and turn I made, they matched. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't outrun them forever, and my gas tank wouldn't last indefinitely. As I crested a hill, I saw Salvation, a highway in the distance, its steady stream of traffic a beacon of hope. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, my engine protesting as I pushed it beyond its limits. The pursuing vehicles were right on my tail now. I could hear shouts and the occasional ping of something hitting my car. Were they shooting at me? The highway was so close, just a few more seconds. With a final burst of speed, I shot onto the on-ramp, merging into the flow of traffic. I weaved between cars, putting as much distance as I could between myself and my pursuers. When I finally dared to look in my rearview mirror again, I saw their headlights receding into the distance. They couldn't risk following me onto a busy highway. I didn't slow down until the sun began to rise, casting a pale glow over the desert landscape. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel, and my whole body ached with tension, but I was alive, and I was free. When I finally felt safe enough to stop, I pulled into a busy truck stop, my legs shaking as I got out of the car. The events of the night felt surreal in the harsh light of day. Had I imagined it all? But the dents in my car door and the empty gas tank were stark reminders that it had all been terrifyingly real. I called the police from a payphone, my voice shaking as I recounted my experience. They took my statement, but I could hear the skepticism in the officer's voice. A whole town of crazed kidnappers. It sounded insane, even to my own ears. As I waited for my car to fill up, surrounded by the comforting bustle of normal travelers, I couldn't shake the memory of those cold, predatory eyes. What would have happened if I hadn't gotten away? How many others hadn't been so lucky? I never did find out the truth about that town. In the years since, I've scoured maps and searched online, but I've never been able to find any trace of Last Chance Gas or the nameless town that nearly became my final destination. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it even existed at all, or if it was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion and desert heat. But then I look at my car, at the small dents that no body shop has ever been able to fully repair, and I know it was real. I know that somewhere out there, hidden in the vast expanse of the American desert, there's a town that preys on unsuspecting travelers, and I know how close I came to becoming just another missing person, another mystery for someone else to solve. I still take road trips sometimes, but I never drive at night anymore. And I always make sure my tank is full before I hit those long, lonely stretches of highway. Because you never know what might be waiting for you at that next exit, in those small towns that seem frozen in time. Sometimes, a pit stop can become a fight for survival, and the difference between life and death can be as simple as a full tank of gas. The moment I saw the boy's eyes, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What I thought was an act of kindness had led me straight into a trap, and now I was facing a nightmare I never could have imagined. I've always been an adventurous soul. That's why, when I felt the stress of my job in the city becoming too much, I decided to take a solo camping trip in the vast wilderness of Maine. I craved the solitude, the chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. If only I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked through dense forests, marveling at the towering pines and the chorus of bird song that accompanied me. I set up camp near crystal clear streams, falling asleep to the gentle babble of water over rocks. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I had ventured further into the wilderness than I'd planned, drawn by the promise of a beautiful valley I'd spotted on my map. The hike was challenging, but the views were worth it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I started to make my way back to my campsite. That's when I heard it, a faint cry, almost lost in the rustle of leaves and the evening calls of birds. I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, definitely human, and definitely in distress. Without hesitation, I veered off the trail, following the sound. As I pushed through the undergrowth, the cries grew louder. Finally, I broke into a small clearing and saw him, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, lying on the ground and clutching his leg. "Hey there," I called out softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. I fell," he whimpered. "My leg hurts. I can't move it." I approached slowly, my heart aching for this lost child. "It's all right," I soothed. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" "Tommy," he sniffled. "Okay, Tommy. I'm Sarah. Let's take a look at that leg, shall we?" As I knelt beside him, I noticed his clothes were torn and dirty, as if he'd been out here for a while. How long had this poor kid been lost in the woods? I gently examined his leg, relieved to find no obvious breaks. It seemed to be just a bad sprain. "Good news, Tommy. I don't think it's broken. But we should get you back to your family. Are they camping nearby?" Tommy nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Yeah, not too far, but I don't know how to get back." I smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, we'll find them together. Can you walk if I help you?" He shook his head, his lower lip trembling. "It hurts too much." "All right then," I said, making a quick decision. "I'll carry you. Just point me in the right direction, okay?" Tommy nodded, and I carefully lifted him onto my back. He was lighter than I expected, and I could feel his small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. We set off, Tommy giving me vague directions. The sun had fully set now, and the forest was growing dark. I flicked on my headlamp, the narrow beam of light creating eerie shadows among the trees. As we walked, something began to nag at the back of my mind. Tommy's directions seemed to be leading us deeper into the woods, away from any areas where I'd expect to find campsites. but I pushed the thought aside. Kids often got confused in the woods, I told myself. We'd find his family soon enough. After what felt like hours of walking, I saw a faint light through the trees. "Look, Tommy," I said, relief flooding through me. "I think we've found them." But as we got closer, my relief turned to unease. It wasn't a campsite I was seeing, but a ramshackle cabin, barely visible in the gloom. The light was coming from a single, grimy window. "Is this where your family is staying?" I asked, a note of skepticism creeping into my voice. "Yep," Tommy chirped, suddenly sounding much more cheerful. "You can put me down now. I can walk the rest of the way." Alarm bells were ringing in my head, but before I could react, the cabin door burst open. 3 men emerged, their faces hidden in shadow. One of them called out, "Good job, Tommy, you can come here now." Tommy scrambled off my back with an agility that belied his supposed injury. He ran to the men, disappearing behind them into the cabin. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. One of the men stepped forward, roused, and I could see his face clearly now, weathered, with cold eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like Tommy brought us a guest. Why don't you come inside? We insist." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No, I should be going. My campsite isn't far, and people will be expecting me." The man's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, you're a long way from any campsite out here, and no one's expecting you. No one even knows you're here." With shocking speed, he lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a vice-like grip. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. The other 2 men approached, and I saw the glint of a knife in one of their hands. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the first man growled. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I brought my knee up hard, catching my captor in the groin. As he doubled over, I wrenched my arm free and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. I could hear shouts behind me, and the crashing of heavy footsteps in pursuit. I ran blindly, with no idea where I was going, driven only by the primal need to escape. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear them getting closer, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rocks and branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and in pain. As I struggled to my feet, I realized I'd fallen into a shallow ravine. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, a river, hidden in the darkness. Without thinking, I plunged in, letting the current carry me downstream and away from my pursuers. The water was icy cold, shocking the breath from my lungs. I fought to keep my head above water as the river swept me along. Behind me, I could hear distant shouts of frustration. They'd lost my trail. I don't know how long I was in the water. It could have been minutes or hours. Finally, exhausted and half frozen, I managed to drag myself onto the riverbank. I lay there for a long time, shivering and gasping for breath. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the wilderness, soaking wet, with no supplies and no idea which direction to go. And somewhere out there, those men were still looking for me. I forced myself to my feet, knowing I couldn't stay in one place. I picked a direction and started walking, using the stars to try and orient myself. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I walked through the night and into the next day, stopping only when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. I found berries to eat and drank from streams, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of pursuit. It was late afternoon when I finally heard something that wasn't the forest, the distant rumble of a car engine. With renewed energy, I pushed towards the sound. Eventually, I broke through the tree line and saw a road stretching out before me. I flagged down the first car that passed, probably looking like a wild woman with my torn clothes and tangled hair. The elderly couple inside were alarmed at first, but after hearing my story, they quickly offered to drive me to the nearest town. At the local police station, I recounted my harrowing experience. The officers were skeptical at first, but as I described the cabin and the men in detail, their expressions grew serious. They told me there had been rumors of a group living off the grid in those woods, possibly involved in criminal activities. My statement was the first solid lead they'd had. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a small motel, I learned that the police had found the cabin, but it was empty, the men and the boy long gone. They'd vanished into the vast wilderness, leaving behind only questions and the haunting memory of what might have been. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never in unfamiliar territory. The experience taught me that while nature can be beautiful, it can also hide terrible dangers. And sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones that look just like us. Every time I see a lost child now, I'm torn between the instinct to help and the memory of Tommy's betrayal. It's a harsh lesson, but one I'll never forget. That sometimes, an act of kindness can lead you straight into a trap. And in the wilderness, the line between savior and victim can disappear in the blink of an eye. The moment I saw the desk clerk's eyes widen in fear as he handed me the room key, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. But by then, it was too late. We were already trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway for me and my girlfriend, Lily. We'd been dating for a year, and with both of us swamped at work, we desperately needed some time alone together. When I found a great deal on a secluded motel online, it seemed perfect. The reviews were sparse but positive, and the photos showed charming, rustic rooms surrounded by picturesque woodland. We booked it without a second thought. The drive took longer than expected. By the time we pulled into the motel's gravel parking lot, night had fallen, and a thick fog had rolled in, obscuring everything beyond the dim glow of the vacancy sign. The building loomed before us, a hulking shadow against the starless sky. "Well, this is atmospheric," Lily said, trying to sound upbeat, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It'll look better in the daylight. Come on, let's check in and get some rest." The reception area was small and poorly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. A musty smell hung in the air, like old books and damp wood. Behind the desk stood a thin, nervous-looking man with darting eyes and a perpetual frown. "Welcome to the Pinewood Motel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have a reservation?" I gave him our names, and he began typing slowly on an ancient computer. As he worked, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Is everything okay?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. He looked up sharply, fear flashing across his face for a split second before he composed himself. "Of course, sir. Just a long night. Here's your key. Room 13. As he handed over the key, our fingers brushed, and I felt him press something into my palm, a small scrap of paper. Before I could react, he turned away, busying himself with some paperwork. Confused, I pocketed the paper and led Lily to our room. The corridor was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Room 13 was at the end of the hall. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a space that looked nothing like the photos online. The furniture was old and battered, the carpet stained, and a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. "Maybe we should find somewhere else," Lily said, wrinkling her nose at the musty smell. I was about to agree when I remembered the scrap of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it, my blood running cold as I read the hastily scrawled message. "Don't sleep. Don't shower. Get out." "What's that?" Lily asked, noticing my expression. I showed her the note, watching as her face paled. "We need to leave. Now," I said, grabbing our bags. But as I turned the handle, my heart sank. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, then threw my shoulder against it, but it was like trying to move a brick wall. What's going on? Lily's voice was tight with fear. I don't know, but we're getting out of here, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I moved to the window, but it was sealed shut, the glass too thick to break easily. That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Lily and I froze, staring at each other in horror as the footsteps stopped right outside our door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a key turned in the lock. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a weapon, anything. But there was nowhere to go, nothing to use. We were trapped. The door swung open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face like chiseled stone. Behind him stood two others, equally imposing. Well, the first man said, his voice a low growl. Looks like we've got some new guests. I stepped in front of Lily, my heart pounding. What do you want from us? The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. Want? Oh, we don't want anything. You're the ones who came to us, remember? Checked in of your own free will. A chill ran down my spine as the implications of his words sank in. This wasn't a random attack. This was planned. We'd walked right into their trap. Please, Lily said, her voice shaking. Just let us go. We won't tell anyone, I swear. The man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Oh, we know you won't tell anyone. No one ever does. They advanced into the room, and I knew we had to act. In a desperate move, I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it at the nearest man. It connected with a satisfying crunch, and he stumbled back, clutching his face. Run! I yelled to Lily, shoving past the stunned man and pulling her with me. We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of angry shouts and pounding footsteps close behind. The reception area was empty, the nervous clerk nowhere to be seen. We burst through the front doors and into the foggy night. Our car was where we'd left it, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, a hand smashed through the driver's side window, grabbing at my throat. Lily screamed, and I stomped on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the hand releasing me as we sped away. In the rearview mirror, I could see figures emerging from the fog, growing smaller as we put distance between us and that hellish motel. We drove for hours, not daring to stop, jumping at every set of headlights we saw. When the sun finally began to rise, we pulled into a busy truck stop, both of us exhausted and shell-shocked. What just happened? Lily asked, her voice hoarse. I shook my head, still struggling to process it all. I don't know, but we need to call the police. The local sheriff's department was skeptical at first, but as we recounted our story, providing details about the motel and the men who'd attacked us, their attitude changed. They told us there had been rumors about disappearances in that area for years, but never any solid evidence. In the days that followed, as we gave statements and identified suspects from photo lineups, the full horror of what we'd escaped became clear. The Pinewood Motel wasn't just a front for kidnapping. It was part of a larger trafficking operation that had been operating undetected for years. The police raid on the motel uncovered hidden rooms and evidence of countless victims, but many of the key players, including the men who'd attacked us, had vanished without a trace. Lily and I tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of that night haunted us. We both started having nightmares, jumping at shadows, always looking over our shoulders. Our relationship, strained by the trauma we'd endured, eventually fell apart. Even now, years later, I can't drive past a motel without feeling a surge of panic. The flashing vacancy signs that once promised rest and comfort now seem like warnings, beckoning unsuspecting travelers into darkness. I often think about that nervous clerk who tried to warn us. Did he escape too? Or did he pay the price for his moment of conscience? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for the unwary. A simple booking, a quest for a quiet getaway, can turn into a fight for survival in the blink of an eye. So the next time you're planning a trip and you come across that perfect deal for a secluded motel, think twice. Because sometimes the real price of a room is far higher than you could ever imagine. And sometimes the guests who check in don't check out. The moment I heard the click of the door locking behind me, I knew this wasn't going to be a typical food delivery. The man's eyes, wild and desperate, told me I had just walked into something far more dangerous than a late-night pizza craving. My name's Mike, and I've been delivering pizzas for Joe's Pizza for about 6 months now. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and usually, the biggest excitement is hoping for a good tip. That all changed on a quiet Tuesday night in October. It had been a slow evening, and I was about to call it quits when one last order came in. The address was on the outskirts of town, in one of those areas where the houses are few and far between. I'd delivered out there before, so I didn't think much of it. As I drove, the houses became more sparse, the street lights fewer and farther between. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by my headlights. I finally pulled up to the house. A large, somewhat run-down two-story that looked like it had seen better days. I grabbed the pizza and made my way to the front door. The porch light flickered ominously, casting strange shadows across the overgrown yard. I rang the doorbell, hearing it echo inside the house. After a moment, the door creaked open. A man stood there, middle-aged, with disheveled hair and a 5 o'clock shadow. His eyes darted nervously behind me before settling on my face. "Joe's Pizza," I said, forcing a smile. "That'll be $15.50. The man nodded, his movements jerky. Come in. I've got the money inside." Warning bells went off in my head. We're not supposed to enter customers' homes, but before I could protest, he had grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the distinct sound of a lock clicking into place. The interior of the house was dimly lit and cluttered. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the man could hear it. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I really should just wait out." "Shut up," the man hissed, his eyes wild. "They'll hear you." "Who'll hear me?" I asked, confusion mixing with my growing fear. The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. "They're out there," he muttered. "Watching. Always watching." I was starting to think I'd walked in on some paranoid delusion when I heard it, a muffled cry coming from upstairs. The man's head snapped towards the sound, panic flashing across his face. "What was that?" I demanded, my fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just the TV. Now, about that pizza." But I wasn't listening anymore. The cry came again, louder this time. It sounded like a woman, and she was in distress. "There's someone up there," I said, taking a step towards the stairs. "They need help." The man moved with surprising speed, blocking my path. "No one's up there," he growled, all pretense of normality gone. "You're not going anywhere." That's when I saw the gun tucked into his waistband. My blood ran cold as I realized the gravity of the situation I'd stumbled into. "Please," I said, raising my hand slowly. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go and we can forget this ever happened." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "It's too late for that. You're part of this now." Another cry from upstairs, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. The man's eyes widened in panic. No, he muttered, turning towards the stairs. In that moment of distraction, I acted on instinct. I threw the pizza box at his face, the hot cheese and sauce momentarily blinding him. As he stumbled back, I bolted for the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, precious seconds ticking by as I struggled to open it. Behind me, I could hear the man recovering, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Just as my hand closed around the doorknob, I felt a searing pain in my side. The man had tackled me, sending us both crashing to the ground. We grappled on the floor, my pizza grease-slicked hand slipping as I tried to fend him off. "You don't understand," he panted, his face inches from mine. "I can't let you leave. They'll kill her if anyone finds out." Another scream from upstairs, this one clearer. "Help! Someone please help me!" The man's grip loosened for just a second, his head turning toward the sound. It was all the opening I needed. I brought my knee up hard, catching him in the stomach. As he doubled over, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the stairs. I took them two at a time, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the man behind me, his curses mixing with the woman's cries for help. The upstairs hallway was dark, but I could see a sliver of light coming from under one of the doors. I ran towards it, throwing my shoulder against the wood. The door burst open, revealing a scene that would haunt me for years to come. A woman was tied to a chair, her face bruised and tear-stained. Her eyes widened in surprise and hope as she saw me. "Please," she gasped, "help me." I didn't hesitate. I ran to her, my fingers working frantically at the knots binding her wrists. Behind me, I could hear the man's heavy breathing as he reached the top of the stairs. "Get away from her!" he roared, his footsteps thundering down the hall. The last knot came loose just as he reached the doorway. The woman stood on shaky legs, clinging to me for support. "We have to jump," I said, gesturing to the window. It was our only chance. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. We moved as one, rushing towards the window as the man lunged for us. Glass shattered around us as we crashed through. For a moment, we were falling, the cool night air whipping past us. Then we hit the ground hard, rolling across the overgrown lawn. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I staggered to my feet, pulling the woman up with me. We ran, not daring to look back, the sound of the man's enraged shouts fading behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached a gas station about a mile down the road. The attendant took one look at our battered, bleeding forms and immediately called the police. What followed was a whirlwind of police statements, hospital visits, and media attention. The woman, whose name was Lisa, had been kidnapped by the man, her ex-husband, over a week ago. He had been holding her captive, convinced that shadowy figures were out to get them both. As for me, I was hailed as a hero, though I didn't feel like one. I had just been doing a job, delivering a pizza. It was chance, or fate, or maybe just dumb luck that had put me in the right place at the right time to save Lisa's life. In the weeks that followed, as the story faded from the news and life began to return to normal, I found myself unable to shake the memory of that night. Every time I got into my car for a delivery, I felt a twinge of fear. Every darkened house, every strange sound made my heart race. I stuck with the job, though, partly because I needed the money, but also because of something Lisa had said to me in the hospital. "You were my guardian angel," she'd told me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You came when I had almost given up hope." Those words stayed with me, reminding me that sometimes a simple act, like delivering a pizza, can change someone's life forever. It's a heavy responsibility, knowing that any routine call could turn into a life or death situation. But it's also a powerful reminder of the impact we can have on each other's lives, often without even realizing it. So I keep driving, keep delivering pizzas to strangers, homes. And if sometimes I'm a little more cautious, a little more observant of my surroundings, well, can you blame me? After all, you never know when a simple delivery might turn into something much more. The moment I saw the glint of metal under the driver's seat, I knew this wasn't just any used car. What I thought was a great deal had just become a death sentence, and I was now in the crosshairs of people who wouldn't hesitate to kill for what was hidden in this vehicle. It all started innocently enough. I'd been saving up for months to buy my first car, scouring online listings and local dealerships for something reliable but affordable. When I came across the ad for a classic '67 Mustang at a price that seemed too good to be true, I should have known better. But the photos looked great, and the seller, a guy named Mike, seemed friendly enough over the phone. We agreed to meet at a garage on the outskirts of town. It was a bit out of the way, but Mike assured me it was where he kept the car stored. As I pulled up, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. The Mustang sat gleaming in the sunlight, its cherry red paint job looking far better than I'd expected for the price. Mike was there waiting, a tall guy with an easy smile and a firm handshake. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" he said, patting the car's hood affectionately. I circled the vehicle, trying to appear knowledgeable even though I knew next to nothing about cars. "Looks great," I said, peering at the engine. "Why are you selling it so cheap?" Mike's smile faltered for just a second. You know how it is. Times are tough, need the cash quick. Plus, it's just been sitting here gathering dust. Rather see her go to someone who'll appreciate her." It all sounded reasonable enough, and after a short test drive where the car performed beautifully, I was sold. We did the paperwork right there. Cash exchanged hands, and suddenly I was the proud owner of a classic Mustang. As I drove home, I couldn't stop grinning. The purr of the engine, the admiring looks from other drivers. I felt on top of the world. It wasn't until I got home and started really exploring the car that things took a turn. I was adjusting the driver's seat when I noticed something odd. There was a small tear in the upholstery, and something was glinting inside. Curious, I reached in and felt around. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. When I pulled it out, my heart nearly stopped. It was a gun, a sleek, deadly-looking pistol that had been carefully hidden in the seat cushion. My mind raced. What was a gun doing hidden in the car? Had Mike forgotten about it? Or was there something more sinister going on? Before I could process this, I heard the screech of tires outside. I looked out the window to see a black SUV pull up, 2 men in dark suits stepping out. They didn't look like police, and the way they were scanning the street sent a chill down my spine. Instinctively, I ducked down, my heart pounding. Through the gap in the curtains, I watched as they approached my house, their hands hovering near their jackets in a way that suggested they were armed. A sharp knock on the door made me jump. "Open up!" a gruff voice called. "We know you're in there." I stayed silent, my mind whirling. Who were these men? What did they want? And what had I gotten myself into by buying this car? The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Last chance. Open up or we're coming in." In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was going on, it was clear these men meant business, and I doubted they were here to welcome me to the neighborhood. As quietly as I could, I made my way to the back door. I could hear the men at the front, the sound of splintering wood telling me they were forcing their way in. With shaking hands, I unlocked the back door and slipped out into the evening air. I ran to the Mustang, fumbling with the keys. Just as I got the door open, I heard shouts from the house. They'd discovered I was gone. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, tires squealing. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men running back to their SUV. The chase was on. I sped through the neighborhood, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The SUV was right behind me, gaining ground with every turn. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. As I hit the highway, a thought struck me. The gun, whatever these men wanted, it had to be connected to the gun I'd found. Maybe there was something else hidden in the car. Keeping one eye on the road and one on the pursuing SUV, I reached down and felt around the tear in the seat. My fingers brushed against something else, a small, hard object wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out, nearly swerving off the road as I saw what it was. A USB drive, innocuous looking, but clearly valuable enough for these men to chase me across town. A bullet pinged off the rear of the car, making me duck instinctively. They were shooting at me now, apparently done with the pretense of a peaceful resolution. I knew I couldn't outrun them forever. The Mustang was fast, but the SUV had the advantage of weight and power. I needed a plan, and fast. Up ahead, I saw the exit for the old industrial district, a maze of abandoned warehouses and factories. It was my best shot at losing them. I took the exit hard, the Mustang fishtailing as I struggled to keep control. The SUV was right behind me, the men inside surely grinning at having cornered their prey. But I had one advantage they didn't: desperation. I weaved through the narrow streets, taking turns at random, praying I wouldn't hit a dead end. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, and for a moment, I dared to hope I'd lost them. Then, as I rounded a corner, my heart sank. A chain-link fence blocked the road, too high to drive through. I was trapped. The SUV appeared behind me, cutting off any chance of retreat. The men got out, guns drawn, triumphant looks on their faces. "End of the line, kid," one of them called out. "Hand over the drive and we'll make this quick." I looked at the USB in my hand, then at the guns pointed at me. In that moment, I made a choice. I revved the engine, the Mustang's powerful motor drowning out the men's shouts. With a silent prayer, I floored it. The car shot forward, straight at the fence. The men fired, bullets pinging off the metal around me. But I didn't slow down. The Mustang hit the fence at full speed. There was a moment of resistance, then the satisfying sound of metal giving way. I burst through onto an empty lot beyond, leaving the stunned men behind. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hands shaking as the adrenaline wore off. I found a 24-hour diner and collapsed into a booth, ordering a coffee I knew I wouldn't drink. As I sat there, the USB drive heavy in my pocket, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Clearly, I'd stumbled into something big, something dangerous. The car, the gun, the drive, it was all connected, and people were willing to kill to get their hands on it. I knew I should go to the police, but would they believe me? And what if these men had connections in law enforcement? No, I realized with a sinking feeling, I was on my own. Whatever was on this drive, whatever I'd gotten myself mixed up in, I had to see it through. As dawn broke, I made my decision. I couldn't go home. It wasn't safe. I couldn't trust anyone. But I had to know what was on the drive, what was worth all this trouble. I paid for my untouched coffee and walked out to the Mustang. As I slid into the driver's seat, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I didn't know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same. The engine purred to life, and I pulled out onto the empty morning streets. Whatever came next, I was ready. Or at least, I hoped I was. Because something told me this was just the beginning of a very dangerous journey. The moment I heard the muffled voices and saw the flickering lights in the supposedly abandoned factory, I knew my boring night shift had just turned into a fight for survival. What I didn't know was that uncovering this secret operation would push me to my limits and change my life forever. My name's Jack, and I've been working as a night security guard at the old Riverside factory for about 6 months now. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of time to work on my novel. Most nights, my biggest challenge is staying awake during my rounds. That all changed on a chilly Tuesday night in October. I'd just started my shift, settling into the small security office with a thermos of coffee and my laptop. The factory had been shut down for years, a relic of the town's industrial past. Now it was just a hulking shadow on the outskirts of town, waiting for someone to either renovate it or tear it down. Around 2 a.m., I started my first round. The factory was huge, a maze of old machinery and empty storage rooms. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as I made my way through the building, flashlight in hand. I was about halfway through my round when I heard it, a faint sound, like voices coming from the far end of the factory. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind whistling through the broken windows, or some stray animals that had found their way inside. But as I got closer, the sound became clearer, definitely voices, and definitely human. My heart started to race. In 6 months, I'd never encountered anyone else in the factory at night. Something was very wrong. I switched off my flashlight, not wanting to alert whoever was there to my presence. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a faint glow coming from under one of the old storage room doors. Cautiously, I crept closer, straining my ears to make out what was being said. The voices were low and urgent, talking about shipments and deadlines. This wasn't just some teenagers looking for a place to party. This sounded serious. I reached for my radio, ready to call for backup, when suddenly the voices got louder. They were coming towards the door. Panic surged through me as I realized I had nowhere to hide. The hallway was long and empty, offering no cover. Just as the door started to open, I made a split-second decision. I ducked into a small alcove, pressing myself against the wall and holding my breath. 2 men walked out, both wearing dark clothes and carrying duffel bags. "We need to move faster," one of them was saying. "The boss wants this shipment out by morning." "Relax," the other replied. "No one ever comes here. We've got all the time in the world." As they passed by my hiding spot, I caught a glimpse inside the room they'd left. My eyes widened in shock. The space was filled with tables covered in white powder, scales, and packaging materials. It was a drug lab, right here in the old factory. My mind raced. What should I do? Call the police? Try to gather more evidence? As I was debating my next move, I heard a sharp intake of breath. I turned to see one of the men staring right at me, his face a mask of surprise and anger. "Hey!" he shouted. "What the hell are you doing here?" I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I bolted, running as fast as I could down the hallway. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of heavy footsteps in pursuit. My heart was pounding as I raced through the factory, trying to remember the layout and find the quickest way out. But in my panic, everything looked unfamiliar. I took a wrong turn and found myself in the old production area, a vast space filled with rusting machinery. I ducked behind an old conveyor belt, trying to catch my breath and think. I could hear the men searching for me, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. "He's got to be the night guard," one of them said. "Find him. We can't let him get out of here." I knew I had to call for help. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone, only to see there was no signal. Of course, the thick factory walls always blocked reception. I'd have to get outside to call for help. As I was trying to figure out my next move, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to see one of the men, his face twisted in a snarl. "Got you," he growled. Acting on pure instinct, I swung my flashlight, connecting with the side of his head. He stumbled back, cursing, and I took off running again. I could see the exit sign glowing faintly in the distance. Freedom was so close. But as I ran towards it, more figures emerged from the shadows. I was surrounded. "Nowhere to run now, buddy," one of them said, a cruel smile on his face. "You should have minded your own business." I backed up, my eyes darting around for any chance of escape. That's when I saw it, the old freight elevator. Without thinking, I lunged for it, slamming the button and praying it still worked. To my amazement, the doors creaked open. I dove inside just as the men reached me, the doors closing on their angry shouts. The elevator groaned and began to move, taking me up towards the roof. As I caught my breath, I realized I'd only bought myself a little time. They would be waiting for me when the doors opened again. I needed a plan. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and I braced myself. As the doors opened, I was hit with a blast of cold night air. I was on the roof, the town spread out below me, lights twinkling in the distance. I could hear shouts and footsteps coming from the stairwell. They were coming. I ran to the edge of the roof, looking for any way down. That's when I saw it, the old fire escape, rusted but still intact. Without hesitation, I swung myself over the edge and onto the metal stairs. They creaked ominously under my weight, but held. I started to climb down, moving as fast as I dared. I was about halfway down when I heard voices above me. They'd found the fire escape. I looked down. It was still a long drop to the ground, but I had no choice. I took a deep breath and jumped. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my legs, but adrenaline kept me moving. I staggered to my feet and ran, heading for the fence that surrounded the factory grounds. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. The fence loomed ahead, topped with barbed wire. It might as well have been 100 feet tall. But then I saw it. A small gap where the fence had pulled away from the post. It was a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I threw myself at it, feeling the metal scratch and tear at my clothes as I wriggled through. I was out. I ran across the empty lot, not stopping until I reached the main road. There, under the glow of a streetlight, I finally pulled out my phone. This time, there was a signal. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. "Please," I gasped as soon as the operator answered. "I need help. There's a drug operation at the old Riverside factory. They're after me." The next few hours were a blur. Police cars with flashing lights, questions from stone-faced detectives, a trip to the hospital to check out my injuries. By the time the sun rose, the factory had been raided, the drug operation shut down, and several arrests made. As I sat in the police station, giving my statement for what felt like the 100th time, I couldn't help but think about how differently the night could have gone. If I'd been a few seconds slower, if the elevator hadn't worked, if the fence had been intact, I might not have made it out alive. The detectives told me I was a hero, that I'd helped bust one of the biggest drug operations in the state, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt exhausted, sore, and more than a little traumatized. As I finally left the station, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight, I realized my life would never be the same. My quiet job as a night watchman was over. The simple life I'd known had been shattered. But as I walked home, my body aching but my spirit unbroken, I felt something else too. A sense of pride, of accomplishment. I'd faced true danger and come out the other side. I'd made a difference. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready for it. After all, how many aspiring novelists get to live through their own thriller? The moment I saw his eyes glinting in the flickering porch light, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. What I thought was a refuge from the storm had just become a trap, and I was the prey. It had been a long day on the road. I was driving cross-country, chasing a job opportunity in California that promised to turn my life around. The weather had been perfect for the first 2 days of my journey, but as I crossed into Nevada, things took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a downpour unlike anything I'd ever seen. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of my car. I slowed to a crawl, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I strained to make out the road ahead. That's when it happened. A deafening crack of thunder startled me, and I jerked the wheel. My old Honda skidded on the wet asphalt, spinning once before coming to a stop on the shoulder. When I tried to restart it, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key again and again. Nothing. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, in a storm that showed no signs of letting up. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by desert and scrubland. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do, I saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a gas station or a rest stop, somewhere I could at least wait out the storm and call for help. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the rain. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, and within seconds I was soaked to the bone. But I pressed on, my eyes fixed on that distant light. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station, but a house. It was an old place, 2 stories of weathered wood and peeling paint. But the porch light was on, a beacon of hope in the storm. I hesitated for a moment at the bottom of the porch steps. Knocking on a stranger's door in the middle of the night wasn't ideal, but neither was staying in my broken-down car or trying to walk to the next town. I climbed the steps and knocked. For a long moment, there was no response. I was about to knock again when I heard movement inside. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s, with weathered skin and sharp, dark eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. his voice gravelly. I explained my situation, practically shouting to be heard over the howling wind. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car broke down, and I saw your light. Could I use your phone to call for help?" The man studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside. "Can't leave you out in this storm." Relief washed over me as I stepped inside. The house was warm and dry, if a bit musty. Old newspapers and books were stacked everywhere, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. "The phone's in the kitchen," the man said, leading me through the cluttered living room. "I'm Frank, by the way." "Sarah," I replied, following him. "Thank you so much for this." But when we reached the kitchen, my heart sank. The phone on the wall was an ancient rotary model, its cord frayed and yellowed with age. Frank must have seen my expression. "It still works," he assured me, "but the lines might be down because of the storm. Why don't you get dried off and wait it out? I'm sure it'll pass soon." I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to brave the storm, rather than stay in this strange house with this strange man. But another crack of thunder made me jump, and I realized I had no choice. "That'd be great," I said, forcing a smile. "Thank you." Frank nodded and disappeared upstairs, returning a moment later with a towel and some clothes. "These were my daughters," he explained. "She doesn't live here anymore." I thanked him, and he showed me to a small bathroom where I could change. As I peeled off my wet clothes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Frank's eyes had lingered on me a bit too long, or the odd way he'd spoken about his daughter. I changed quickly and stepped back into the hallway. That's when I heard it. A thump from upstairs, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry. My heart began to race. "Frank!" I called out. No answer. Against my better judgment, I moved towards the stairs. The crying sound came again, definitely human, definitely in distress. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Frank would hear it. At the top was a long hallway with several closed doors. The sound seemed to be coming from the one at the end. I approached it cautiously, straining my ears. Yes, there was definitely someone in there. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. Just as I was about to turn it, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to find Frank standing there, his eyes no longer friendly but cold and hard. Now, he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Didn't anyone ever tell you it's rude to snoop in other people's houses?" I tried to back away, but he held me firmly. "I'm sorry," I stammered. I heard a noise." Frank's grip tightened. "You shouldn't have come up here, Sarah. You really shouldn't have." In that moment, I knew I was in serious trouble. I did the only thing I could think of. I brought my knee up hard, catching Frank in the groin. He doubled over, cursing, and I ran. I thundered down the stairs, hearing Frank's heavy footsteps behind me. I reached the front door and yanked it open, plunging back into the storm. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but fear drove me forward. I ran blindly, slipping and sliding in the mud, the sound of pursuit close behind. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness and the rain. But eventually, I saw lights ahead, real lights, the lights of a town. As I burst onto the main street, I saw a police car parked outside a diner. I ran towards it, waving my arms frantically. The officer got out, alarmed by my appearance. Through gasping breaths, I told him what had happened. More police were called, and soon, a whole team was heading out to Frank's house. What they found there chilled me to the bone. Frank had been kidnapping people for years, luring in stranded motorists and holding them captive. They found 3 people locked in upstairs rooms, including a young woman who Frank had been calling his daughter. In the days that followed, as I gave statements and tried to process what had happened, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to becoming another one of Frank's victims. If I hadn't heard that cry, if I hadn't managed to get away. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers lurking behind seemingly innocent facades. But it also showed me my own strength, my ability to fight back when it mattered most. I did eventually make it to California, though the job opportunity had long since passed. But I found something else there, a sense of purpose. I started volunteering with organizations that help victims of kidnapping and abuse, sharing my story to help others stay safe. Every time I drive now, especially at night or in bad weather, I think about that stormy night in Nevada. I think about Frank's house, with its welcoming porch light that nearly lured me to my doom. And I'm reminded that sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones that look the most harmless. But I'm also reminded of my own resilience, my ability to survive. That night could have been the end of my story. Instead, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where I'm stronger, wiser, and dedicated to helping others avoid the trap I nearly fell into. So if you're ever driving on a dark, stormy night, and you see a light in the distance promising shelter, think twice. Sometimes, the storm outside is safer than what's waiting behind that friendly porch light. The moment I saw the glint of the knife in his hand, I knew the man who had offered me shelter was no savior. He was a predator, and I had just walked willingly into his lair. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. I'd been feeling stressed at work, and my therapist had suggested I try spending some time in nature to clear my head. The trails in the nearby national forest seemed perfect, challenging enough to be interesting, but well-marked and supposedly safe. I set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, my backpack loaded with water, trail mix, and a first aid kit. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. The fresh air, the sound of birds chirping, the crunch of leaves under my boots. It all helped to melt away the tension I'd been carrying for weeks. But as the day wore on, things started to go wrong. First, I realized I'd underestimated the difficulty of the trail. What was supposed to be a moderate hike turned out to be much more strenuous. Then, clouds rolled in, bringing with them an unseasonable chill and the threat of rain. I decided to turn back, but in my haste, I must have taken a wrong turn. Suddenly, none of the landmarks looked familiar. I tried to retrace my steps, but each attempt only seemed to take me further off course. As the light began to fade and the temperature dropped, panic set in. I was lost. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, only to find I had no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest cell tower, surrounded by dense forest and steep hills that blocked any hope of reception. As darkness fell, the forest took on a sinister quality. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some unknown threat. I was cold, tired, and increasingly desperate. That's when I saw it. A faint light through the trees. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a ranger station or a campground. I moved towards it, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a station, but a cabin. It was a rustic structure, weathered wood and a tin roof, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A single window glowed with warm light, beckoning me like a beacon in the darkness. I hesitated at the edge of the small clearing. Knocking on a stranger's door in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't exactly safe, but neither was spending the night lost in the increasingly cold forest. I took a deep breath and approached the door. My knock was answered almost immediately. The door creaked open to reveal a man in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes. He looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled appearance. "You lost?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, explaining my situation. To my relief, his expression softened. "Can't leave you out here to freeze," he said, stepping aside. "Come on in. Name's Bill." "Thanks," I said, gratitude washing over me as I stepped into the warm cabin. "I'm Mike. I really appreciate this." The interior was snug and cluttered, every surface covered with books, tools, and what looked like animal pelts. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, filling the space with warmth and the scent of wood smoke. "Sit," Bill said, gesturing to a worn armchair. "I'll make some coffee. Warm you up." As he moved to the small kitchenette, I sank into the chair, the events of the day catching up with me. I was safe. I'd be able to get directions back to my car in the morning. Everything was going to be okay. But as I watched Bill prepare the coffee, something began to nag at me. Maybe it was the way his eyes kept darting to me, or the tense set of his shoulders. Something felt off. "So," I said, trying to break the tension, "do you live out here full time?" Bill grunted an affirmative. "Going on 30 years now. Don't much care for people or their noise." "Must get lonely," I ventured. He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. "Oh, I get visitors now and then," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Folks like you, who lose their way." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, suddenly feeling the need to put some distance between us. "You know, maybe I should just get going. If you could just point me in the direction of the main trail." "Sit down," Bill said, his voice hardening. And that's when I saw it, the knife in his hand, its blade catching the firelight. My heart began to race. I looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. But Bill was between me and the only door, and the windows were small and likely nailed shut. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Bill's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "Company," he said simply. "It does get so lonely out here." He took a step towards me, the knife held loosely at his side. I backed up until I felt the wall behind me. My mind raced, trying to remember the self-defense class I'd taken years ago. "Look," I said, holding up my hands. "You don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone I was here. Just let me go, and we can forget this ever happened." Bill laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small cabin. "Oh, I'm not worried about you telling anyone. No one would believe you anyway. And even if they did, they'd never find this place, just like they never found the others." The implications of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Others? How many hikers had wandered to this cabin, thinking they'd found salvation, only to never leave? As Bill took another step forward, I knew I had to act. I feinted to the left, then dove right, aiming for the fireplace. My hand closed around a poker just as Bill crashed into me, sending us both to the floor. We grappled, rolling across the rough wooden planks. The knife flashed, and I felt a searing pain across my arm. But adrenaline kept me going. I brought the poker up hard, catching Bill in the side of the head. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to scramble away. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the latch as I heard Bill getting to his feet behind me. The door flew open and I plunged into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't slow down. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear Bill crashing through the underbrush behind me, his angry shouts echoing through the forest. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, fear and adrenaline pushing me beyond what I thought I was capable of. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness and the terror, but eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the normal nighttime noises of the forest. I slowed to a walk, my lungs burning, my legs feeling like jelly. I was lost again, but this time, that seemed like the least of my problems. I was injured, exhausted, and being hunted by a madman who knew these woods far better than I did. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in my arm became more intense. I looked down to see my sleeve soaked with blood. I needed to stop and tend to the wound, but I was afraid to stay in one place for too long. Just as I was about to give in to despair, I heard something that made my heart leap. The sound of running water. A stream or river could lead me out of the forest, or at least to a road or trail. I followed the sound, moving as quietly as I could. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees. And there, just ahead, I saw it. A small river, its waters reflecting the pale morning light. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let my guard down. I followed the river, staying close to the bank where the terrain was easier to navigate. After what felt like hours, I heard something that brought tears to my eyes, the distant sound of traffic. I quickened my pace, hope giving me a second wind. Finally, I broke through the tree line to see a highway stretching out before me. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably looking like a madman with my torn clothes and bloodied arm. The elderly couple in the car were alarmed at first, but after hearing my story, they quickly offered to drive me to the nearest hospital. As we drove away from the forest, I couldn't help but look back, wondering if Bill was still out there, waiting for his next victim. At the hospital, I told my story to the police. They were skeptical at first, but the evidence of my injuries and my obvious terror convinced them to investigate. They never found Bill or his cabin. It was as if they had vanished into the forest. In the weeks and months that followed, as I recovered from my physical and emotional wounds, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to becoming another missing hiker, another mystery for someone else to solve. The experience changed me, made me more cautious but also more appreciative of life. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone. And I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. Because I learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that look like they're offering help. And that in the wilderness, the line between savior and monster can be terrifying.